Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and we're here with Jules Taylor of the No Easy Answers podcast and the producer for a bunch of shows. Um, we are here talking about Jules's journey on the last couple years to the left, and I've ironically and somewhat darkly entitled this episode "From Burnout to Burnout." Um, and for those of you who cannot see the pun, it is BER. I mean, BERN out and then BURN out. And, these don't ever come out when I record them. I think my audience knows that. But I'm going to preface what's going on right now because I have a strange feeling it's going to come up today. Um, we have seen the following things happen in the second half of the first term of the Biden administration. The DSA has run out of money. I mean, it still has some money, but like they're having to lay off staff. They're having trouble making quorum. It seems like their way of accounting for their membership has actually led them to vastly overestimate their funds, which, kind of makes sense when you try to run things like a church and keep people in the rules for a lot longer than they're actually paying members for. There has been a upswell of solidarity with the Palestinians in Gaza. But it's beginning to take on not just partisan tones. In fact, what's interesting about the Gaza situation is it isn't taking on partisan tones. Like, there's a significant number of the right that's even sympathetic to the Palestinian situation. What is different about it is that the state seems much more concerned about lower levels of protest than even during the Black Lives Matter after George Floyd. Now, I'm going to say that with the amount of they didn't get involved from the state that you hear from people on George Floyd is perhaps overstated. After all, like tear gas canisters were flying even in wealthy neighborhoods during the Floyd protest without a whole lot of concern for wealthy bystanders. And similarly, the tactics that we've seen used at state schools and for non-elite institutions, we're actually seeing being used at elite institutions, not for the first time, but at a scale we have not really seen before. Furthermore, there's been some shenanigans with counter protesters being violent in the University of California, where it looks like a bunch of Mizrahi Jews and other right-wing figures attacked the California encampment, and the police did nothing and even maybe kept the EMTs outside of the circle. So they did this thing where they basically let a group bust heads. They'll probably throw some of those people in jail eventually, but not after they've done their dirty work. So we have these kinds of situations at hand. We also had a left that predicted two things and neither happened. So you had a left that predicted that the Biden administration would lead to a resurgence of economic prosperity. I think on our left, that was a minority view. I think in the general public, it was a majority view in 2001. The kinds of MMT light policies that were sort of kind of played with in the beginning were immediately abandoned due to inflation, which I don't actually think has anything to do with those policies so much as it had to do with price capture, supply chain shifts, competitive advantage of pricing made from the supply chain shifts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there was an increase in the money supply. One thing that has happened, though, is while wages were going up at the ends of the aughts for the first time for low-end people for a long time, and they're still going up, they are now massively underperforming inflation, even though inflation's dropped. So all these things is in the context of which I'm talking to you right now, which is a lot. I mean, I'm throwing a ton out here for context, but I think it's important to get to why this is a particular pivot point for the U.S. left. I also want to point out that there's been a lot of autopsies on the millennial left, and in fact, In some ways, I'm writing one myself. So uh, so a lot of people are trying to reflect on what's happened between, let's say, 2007 and 2022 or 2023, um, which is the end of the Gen X anti-war left, the beginning of the Occupy phase of the left, then into the Social Democratic phase, then into the Bernie phase one. Then we have resistance to Trump phase, Bernie phase two, and now this current milieu. We've also seen a clearing out of a lot of the sects. So the sectarian organizations, particularly the Trotskyist ones, but a lot of them have collapsed during this time period, interestingly. And then some of the weirder ones have survived. In fact, we've seen some deep cuts come back to some kind of weird prominence, such as, did you think we'd be talking about Lyndon LaRouche in 2024? Like,
a lot of the stuff was not on my bingo card, man. I didn't have, like May 68 sort of on a bingo card, or echoes of, you know, I was looking at Daniel Tutt's post earlier today about the picture of the kid that became a poet sitting in the dean of the Columbia University's chair, smoking a cigar. And, it's the imagery from from one era to the next, like the imagery of that kid sitting in the dean's chair versus the imagery of a bunch of police, out there that are militarized and are, I mean, it's like the state is much more organized at this point, and they learn from history. And it seems like they've mobilized and sort of attack these student protests in a way that's much more uh, effective, efficient, sadly,
I mean, there's a lot to it. One thing I'm going to just say is, like, the occupations themselves, even though they're happening in response to things abroad, in the calendar of schooling,
yeah,
to start it just before fucking summer is actually not a great time anyway, because the administrators can wait you out. There's a set time limit and it's coming.
yeah.
But it seems like, one of the things that I found interesting about this, on one hand, the state is stronger, and on another hand, the state is weaker. And I want to ask you a little bit about that. And who knows, by the time this is released from a month when we're recording it, everything may have gone up into smoke again. So
Yeah.
I'm going to put that caveat in case this is all old news. But so I've noticed the tactics on dealing with the state schools have been thus, and I'm saying the state schools, not the elite schools, which is what they've been focusing on in the media, and that was actually by both Democratic and Republican consensus on focusing on places like Columbia and Harvard. They've been doing that for a while, but it really seems to have caught fire at Columbia in specific, partly because it's in New York. But what I find fascinating about this is, on one hand, and in a way that's different from 68, this is an elite affair, and on the other hand, it's absolutely not. So what do I mean by that? Like, it is an elite affair in so much that the schools that we're focused on were elite schools. We are not talking about state schools. We're not talking about Kent State. We're talking about Columbia, and that's a very different scenario. On the other hand, and there's a lot of people who wanted to, not a ton of people, but a lot of people who want to just dismiss it entirely for that. On the other hand, I think there is this way in which this is happening at a moment where we're also seeing an attempt to remilitarize. Remilitarize, actually, in terms of this, is actually the wrong way to say it. Revitalize the labor movement as far as like the UAW, and the UAW is like taking very left-wing positions in regards to a lot of this stuff. However, this contradiction, and I want to get into this a little bit with you, is that Sean Fain's already kissed the ring of Biden in the middle of this, knowing that this was coming up. So while the UAW and his leadership is supporting a lot of these protests as best they can, and of course they would, because one of the things about the UAW is people don't know, is that the UAW's membership is probably a significant minority of people on universities already, since their major growth strategy during the years before Sean Fain was not to try to grow the auto unions, but to try to get into being the union for teaching assistants and adjuncts.
Wow.
So they have a tie to campuses, actually, and they'll get auto workers out there to help with that, because in some weird way the TAs and the auto workers are union brothers, which is weird.
Yeah,
But
it's weird and interesting.
But at the same time, there's also been this floodgate of like, I'm gonna gloat a little bit, Jules, and you can call me out on it, but people catching up to me on the, hey, this great major labor thing that we feel the militancy for, that you guys saying is happening, it's not fake, but it's not translating into what you hoped it's translated into. It's not translating into increased union density. It's not translating into large shop new unions. It's not translating into the service sector being unionized, even in the kind of anemic ways that we've seen in the Starbucks unions. It's not translating to multiple Amazon warehouse unions. We've still only got one, and it's still in arbitration. And that's several years down the road. So it seems like a lot of the post-Bernie hopes are beginning to get dashed too. And while I'm with you on 68, the thing we have to remember about 68 is it got recuperated without shots being fired for the most part. In France, there were no shots fired, and in the U.S., there were shots fired at Kent State. And for actually normie students were killed. They weren't even particularly radical. And I suspect when all is said and done from all this, that yes, we are hearing from radicals who lead a lot of these movements, but a lot of the people who are going to get caught up in this dragnet, and probably the ones who are actually going to end up getting prison time, will be normie kids who just think that, killing a bunch of Palestinians is wrong and maybe we should quit funding it. So I feel like we're in a dark moment. A lot of people seem to think that this will be a time for left revitalization, and this is where I'm going to finally get to you and let you talk for a while. I don't feel that way, but could you tell me where you think the left is and where you're at this moment, Jules?
So, man, I want to stick on the things aren't translating thread for a second. And man, I know that folks have said that you're kind of black-pilled. I tend to think of you as like a rather Schopenhauerian sort of approach, whereas if you're deeply skeptical and inherently pessimistic towards your analysis, insofar as that is the way reality truly is, you are that much closer to the truth. It's kind of what Schopenhauer thought about his philosophy of pessimism. And I've because these moments are so dark, I have definitely begun to look at things in a more pessimistic way. And as an example, listeners might know this about me, but I moved from upstate New York in 2022 down here, 2021, somewhere around there. And I'm a member of CPUSA. I helped organize the Hudson Valley club that was up there and had some success in that. And so I was like, you know what, man, the things that, there were some family things going on. Like my mom had a health, thing that happened that I had to be here for. But I, in my heart of hearts, I was like, man, I'm going to Texas and I'm going to try and organize something with CPUSA, because the things that are at the forefront of what I care about, the rights of the undocumented, rights of trans people, these things are anti-fascism. These things are at the forefront of the battle in Texas. This is where I feel like a lot of the fascist policy goes for a beta testing ground is Texas. It's like, is it too extreme? Well, Texas will volunteer for it. And the conversations are harder down here geographically. It's more spread out. It just seemed like a more challenging area to organize in, and it's proven such too. Yeah. But as far as things not translating, man, I came down here looking to try and make an impact, and I brought projects with me, my no easy answer stuff, and continue to work with working people. And I think where I've come out in this is like, in my efforts to try and organize for CPUSA, I've also like, I joined the DSA down here and see what's going on in the local scene. That seems like, wherever you move to, if you want to find a bunch of lefties, they're all going to be hanging out with the DSA. And you go hang out and you meet these people, and maybe you join up, maybe you pay some dues, whatever. Like I got a flyer in the mail from the DSA at one point that was, the UAW workers promoting their union. And at first I was like, meh, whatever. I got a flyer in the mail from DSA. But I was like, you know what, man? Like, what do people in other political parties get flyers in the mail from their party? And talking about how things don't stick. My mind went from like, or how things don't translate. It's like my mind went from, well, this is great. I'm glad they're supporting workers, to be like, how much of this is translating into real like spreading of union awareness if they're just kind of sending this to their own members? I mean, surely most of us are aware of, the UAW and their struggles. At least if you're a member of the DSA, hopefully you're taking an interest in labor. But how effective is that to send mailers to your own people? Is this what dues money is used for? You mentioned at the top of this how the DSA ran out of money, and I think we had discussed at one point some of the stuff that had gone on between, like, I think there was like some sexual harassment stuff that approved some of the internal arbitration methods of DSA to be kind of ineffective, and it caused a great sort of dent in the overall integrity of their of how we looked at them. But the moment is dark, man. I question, how much being a party in any party, PSL, CPUSA, like how much, what are we doing? What's translating to where? What real gains are we, like part of what I don't appreciate about, like, and I understand this about like parties in general, is that you need to build camaraderie. And so there's like social events and stuff like that. And great, meet your comrades, have fun with them. I understand that some of us require that. Not all of us are political animals, which can speak incessantly about this stuff and organize and want to tackle that. So sometimes, like in these parties, you have to have like these social events things. And it's like, dude, that's not what I'm here for, man. Like the social event stuff, it's like, I wish to organize. And it just seems like even if you join a party, we criticize the Democratic Party for like, what do? They send you out on routes to give pamphlets out to people, and nothing fucking happens, and people don't you don't achieve your policy and political goals to the Democratic Party. It seems like a place where revolutionary energy just goes to die. And this is a really pessimistic take, man, but like, what the fuck is the inherent difference, man, between like joining a party that doesn't do shit or is enfeebled with a lack of power? You can make efforts to build that party up, and surely like it's like kind of planting seeds of a tree that you'll never enjoy the shade from, kind of thing. But fuck, dude, we don't have time. Like we're dying of climate change, man. The police are militarized, and the state is showing how like even the most privileged sons and daughters of people at Columbia University and shit, like they're willing to use this force on them.
Yeah.
The entire goddamn state is like it seems like every institution is working right now on behalf of the continued arming of Israel at this point. Like, not to get conspiratorial around it, but it's like you look on TikTok and Open Secrets and the funding of AIPAC and all that stuff. It's like the entire state, it has been bought off, and we're funding Israel. We're giving them bombs, and even with the tide of public opinion in a nonpartisan sort of way is a total sea change, and yet none of us can stop this. And it is a fucking dark moment, man. And so where I'm at right now is like, I tend to think, and this is, I tend to think like if you have a platform that's one to many,
mm-hmm.
I mean, I used to think that podcasting was not like the greatest sort of avenue to do this, and maybe it's like just in some ways like a vanity project or what have you. But like, it seems like the ubiquity of mediation in our current days means that we have to go through the media in order to one to many, reach as many people as we can. And this is why I've been, I've been thinking along the lines of like, if like Marshall McLuhan and Herbert Marcuse's thought sort of had a baby or something, where it's like, if we could, if the media is the massage and the whole world is mediated, then we must take up media as the form of getting our voices out there and help achieve class consciousness that way. I know that seems like, I mean, I'm going to listen back to this and probably hate listening to myself saying that, because it's like, what the fuck impacts are podcasts doing? I'm questioning the impact of flyers sent out by the DSA. I'm questioning the impact of everything. But it seems like, the only thing that we can rely upon right now is somebody's going to pick up TikTok and scroll, or somebody's going to put a podcast on at some point, or somebody's going to subscribe to a YouTube channel. It's like all fucking clicks and mediated shit. So
Yeah, it's a tough thing. On one hand, I have the deep distrust of mediation being a substitute for politics.
yeah,
On the other hand, and I mean this very seriously, there are two broad tendencies on the left that I have always found a little bit distasteful. One is the collapsarian and or communization and or immiseration thesis. So those are different theses, but it's basically like shit'll get bad enough. Oh, accelerationism also is this. Shit'll get bad enough that people have to go our way. And my response is shit'll get bad enough that it'll go a bunch of different ways, and you are hoping that it just magically goes the way that you want it to. That if we have enough riots, we'll overthrow capital by practicing communism, if that's the communization way, or if we just hold out enough, we can have a relationship to the Democratic Party until we have the true cadre formation to finally leave dirty break style. But that's infinitely in the future, apparently. That's another way. There's the please daddy G come save us, or please third world workers come save us. Now, I have the unpopular opinion that I even find third worldism not only to be just factually not particularly correct, I find it immoral. Because the idea that you're going to ask the most oppressed people on the fucking planet to overthrow the most powerful governments on earth by themselves, and it's not going to be just cascades of dead brown bodies at the border, that to me is like absurd and morally reprobate. And it also gives you an excuse not to have solidarity with people in your own sphere of influence, which is not to say that these anti-colonial struggles, in so much that they still exist, and that's a big in so much that they still exist, aren't worth supporting. They are, but it's to say, like, if you think that's going to be your fighting force to get rid of capital throughout the world, I hate to tell you that the most likely outcome of that is just global nuclear war, and in which case you don't survive anyway. So this is, yeah, I probably sound pretty black pilled to a lot of people. But the reason why I do, I think you're right in that I have a Schopenhauerian pessimism, in so much that I think a lot of people have been feeding themselves bullshit for many, many years, and they've actually abdicated their own responsibility. So in this sense, I'm not black pilled at all. I actually think we have to engage in stuff, but engaging stuff means stripping away anything that you have done that removes your own agency and your role in this. So if I don't like when we always talk about, well, the left doesn't have power, and I'm always like, well, why doesn't it? We actually have a fair amount of numbers. We actually have money. Even like You have made millionaires off of left media, off of far left media. You have. Like, there's diffuse money out there. No, there's not a Mercer family or a Koch family for us. You're right. All right. George Soros, despite what the right wing thinks, does not do that. I've never gotten my Soros check. There are a few rich patrons of of very left wing movements, but they're very small. What they patronize. But it's not even a lack of money. I don't even believe that anymore. It's like all of the above, and it's a refusal to deal with the realities of power. And I mean this in two ways. So you and I are both in our 40s, right?
I'm
Right.
40. Yeah.
Yeah. You just turned 40. I'm a little bit over. I got a couple of toes into the 40s now.
Right.
And I do remember the overly localist left that learned the wrong lessons from the fallout of the 1970s that set the tone for the left that we never talk about, the Gen X left. And I know people get mad when I categorize American left by generations, but it's easier to see what's going on when you do that. And the Gen X left was very localist and very issue driven. It had no unified anything. Not even a unified stance towards the Democratic Party. It had been sucked up into a Bernie-esque campaign that we have written out of history. We forget that both Jesse Jackson campaigns were Bernie-like campaigns. They were. And this has been largely written out of left-wing history. And the response to that in the 90s was cultural rebellion, localism, etc. By the time we get through the Iraq War period and the alter globalization movement becomes morphs through the peace movement into whatever Occupy was, because the recession changed its goals. And I do think we have to see that as one continuous thing. That Occupy, for me, people see as the beginning of the left that we have today, and for a lot of us, it is. It wasn't for me, but for a lot of people, that's their first instantiation. But I said at the time it was actually the end of a different kind of left. That this Graeber Gen X sort of soft anarchist, and I say soft anarchist because there's an habit of over blaming anarchists for every problem on the American left. But this wasn't a soft anarchist movement that emerged in the context of two things happening. China seemingly liberalizing and fully doubling down on its favored nation status with the United States, and the USSR not existing any fucking more. So like, I actually do like when people like, oh, I'm like, well, think about why people weren't Marxists back then. The only Marxists you'd encounter were British trots, all right, who had come in mostly from the UK, because American Trotskyism had also kind of declined precipitously during the 80s, and after 1992 it barely had a reason to exist, because again, I'm not an anti-Trotskyist, I also am not a Trotskyist, despite what people in my comments will say, but Trotskyism only made sense as a response to the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, the rationale for why Trotskyism is even a thing doesn't actually make sense. Like, it was kind of on life support for 3 decades. So that was the left that I came up in. Our response to that, as manifested by Occupy, which is the birth of our left, but also the death of that Gen X left in a very real way. It's a very real passing of the torch. Led to this social democratic moment that had a kind of, to me, both circular and incoherent idea about what our relationship to Democrats were for. So there was more anger at the Democrats after the Obama years than people probably in the liberal world expected. And that led to the dirtbag left. But what the dirtbag left and the social democratic left could not actually do is say, like, okay, the property fund may have made sense in the 1930s. I don't think it did. I'm gonna, but for our good Marxist Leninists, I'll give that it's at least worth a debate, right? Because that is, the Popular Front is the high point of communist membership in the West, in both the United States, France, and Italy. So, we can go back and forth about whether or not that was ultimately good, but today I think even most diehard Marxist Leninist of like, the have little Stalin and in the back in their bedroom poster,
Mm-hmm.
uh that even those guys will admit that this is not a popular front moment. All right. But that's what we decided to do. And we decided to do it by inverting the localism and the kind of no demands into, oh, let's support a candidate with very specific demands, and let's do it within the purview of an inside outside strategy with the Democratic Party. So this emerges as a critique of the Democrats, but ultimately weds us to them. And I think the thing that I think happened that really lost the thread is that in the opposition to Trump, buying into the idea that the Trumpists were true unreprobate fascists and we had to throw everything at them, asterisk, although we didn't really throw everything at them, because punching a Nazi is not what you do if you actually think Nazis are coming to power. You don't punch them. And you can figure out what I think you should do. But let me just say, like, punching is a bit mild, actually.
Mm-hmm.
But so they had this response to that tied us to the resistance libs, etc., and to all of us, even when we were trying to distance ourselves from it, like I was really trying to, we couldn't really do it. Like, and then 2019 happens, 2020 happens, Bernie collapses for the second time, and everyone seems to have lost. But we've made a lot of people, Bashkar Sankara's moved from being like a um, a staff writer for Dissent magazine to in charge of the Nation group. Um, you the left seems to be ascendant culturally after Black Lives Matter gets recuperated. And we see ourselves as being able to push Biden to the left again. I didn't, but I sure as fuck heard most progressive presidents since FDR over and over and over again those first year to 2 years of the Biden administration. And I remember feeling like I was going insane because I'm like, I feel like we're actually dying right now, and you guys think we've won. Like, I feel like somehow between 2016 and 2020 there was a bait and switch, and we saved the very people and party we started critiquing in the beginning of all this cycle. That, like, in some ways, like, it was the energy of the squad and all that shit that gave the Democratic Party the appearance of being a vital force again. And luckily or unluckily, that's been removed from us. But now we don't know what to do. And right now, I think this is an interesting moment because I predict that after these Gaza protests on campuses get crushed, and they haven't been crushed yet, but they're going to be crushed. They are being crushed. I mean, like, the encampment here at U of Utah, I think, lasted 20 hours, and that was it. The cops went and hit him in the middle of the night.
It's my understanding. I mean, we're recording this on May 1st. It's about 5 in the afternoon, and people on Twitter have said University of Texas at Austin, like nothing happened today. It wasn't really an encampment going on. Yeah.
So they arrested some of the leaders here. They're probably, I mean, they're not going to charge them, but they can arrest them, hold them for habeas, and let them go, and to totally disrupt the ability to throw additional protests by taking out the leadership. Which, I'm actually surprised we haven't done more of that in the past. Like, because you don't even have to charge these people. I mean, although it looks like also right now, as of 4:15 Mountain Time, it looks like Biden's gearing up to incorporate the Department of Homeland Security and start throwing the book at the leadership of these student administrations and handing them federal charges the way Trump threatened to do to BLM protesters, but didn't actually do that much. I mean, they did some, but they didn't do as much as I was afraid of. And I find this fascinating because the demands of the Gaza situation, in some ways, okay, there are certain things that are hard, like immediate divestment would be illegal,
right?
Under and formal BDS in certain states like yours is illegal. But there are there's other stuff like disinvestment from the West Bank, disinvestment from arms dealing. That wouldn't even be that hard. All right, like that's not something that's even going to hit the fucking trust funds in their pocketbook that hard, and yet we're not even seeing that. So, and I think that's just where it's at. And what seems wild to me is if I was going to guess who was going to win the election going into 2023, I would have had a slight incumbent advantage with too close to call on Biden. Now, even if Trump is in prison, I put a slight advantage on Trump. And here's the other thing is I have no idea if either one of those are good for the left at all. I have none. But this should be a passing of the torch moment for us. We should be like the millennial left. Okay, we didn't get what we didn't succeed. Everything we talked about from Medicare for all to free college is all just ironically at the moment you think that we could actually pressure for it, it all completely went away, which tells you how serious that project was. It was an opposition project. Anyone who studies the right would actually know this. The rightists do this shit all the time where they promise impossible shit to Tea Partiers or whatever, and as soon as they come to power, they're like, we know better. We weren't ever going to do any of that. Shut the fuck up. I mean, their problem that they're having is like they're beginning to lose the ability to tell their people that they've made false promises to shut the fuck up. Even Trump can't seem to do it now. Like you see this incoherence of the GOP in Congress. So the other thing I think is different, and maybe I want to talk to you about this as in Texas, is I also think the right's in disarray too. The entire political spectrum's like fucking like has no idea what to do right now. What do you make of that?
I mean, I feel like so first I just want to say that like, I listened to your stuff recently about like hauntology and ghosts of different movements and recognizing how these are just kind of ghosts from the past. And I think, what really, I mean, there's a lot. I mean, sometimes your radicalization can always get a little invigorated because you watch a random ass documentary and some thought pops in your head. And for me, one of those moments was watching a documentary about the AIDS movement. And there were people back like before I was alive. I was born in 83, people in the early 80s walking down, protesting in New York City with signs asking for Medicare for all. And it was like, man, that's on the one hand, there's this sort of woo-woo sort of feeling of like, oh man, I'm carrying on the struggle. And sure, we all are. But goddamn, the hopelessness that comes with understanding that people have been requesting this very same thing, and you think about like Canada's got healthcare, and I mean, maybe it's not as advanced, or maybe you got to wait in line a little bit. I don't know. The status of Canadian healthcare seems like it's a lot better than ours. But
unless
I think
you have certain rare forms of cancer, it's better than ours. Until recently, actually, they've been cutting the budget at the provincial level. I mean, one of the things about Canada's thing is it's funded provincially, so it's kind of federalized. So they've been cutting the budget at the provincial level to where things have gotten a lot more dire, like the way the NHS is. And that's led to like, promoting euthanasia as opposed to helping people. Like that's becoming a real thing. But in general, I'd still really rather be sick in Canada than the US. Like I said, unless you have a very rare and advanced form of cancer, you're going to be better off there.
But I wonder how much like the existence of their healthcare system is due in part to perhaps the counterweight of the Soviet Union. Like
absolutely,
like
that's why the NHS exists for sure. Like,
yeah. So I mean, I think that we really have like kind of glossed over the way that the last 30 years we have not had that counterweight to encourage a social welfare system that it has real things to show for it, like Canadian healthcare system. But when you watch an old documentary and You see people that were carrying Medicare for All signs before you were even born. Another thing that got me on this was like, I went back and read Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver. And, he's talking about the removal of federal monuments in that book, and about how there was like a social debate happening at the time. Should they remove Confederate monuments, and there's some lines in there about how the entire white race, he says, is woken up to find their heroes as villains, and the supervillain of all of them is Churchill. And so like these sort of things that I was, I during the George Floyd protest, it's not like, I think there were a lot of us that are younger that thought, okay, well, the Confederate monuments thing, this is really coming to a head now. It's like, well, this has been the long eruption, since the 60s. So for as much as like, I feel like, I wish to contribute towards this struggle, and it's like not work that you're obligated to finish, but it's work that you can't abandon. Man, like what it goes back to the question of effectiveness and what's translating, and are we doing anything to contest power? And there are just times, man, where it's like how many inflective moments do we have to go through? Like how many? I mean, there are times every 6 months I wake up and I'm like, this is a turning point. And it's like, what are we actually doing? How are we actually, posing problems to power? And I don't think we're doing enough of it. And I don't have the answers either. I don't think accelerationism is the answer. I definitely don't. Like, I mean, you see people and as far as the scatteredness you're referring to, man, like, you see some of the scatteredness. I think that right-wing, people attacking power stations is a symptom of that scatteredness. I think that, I mean, what the hell just happened in the news recently? Like there's like Trump's possible VP candidate murdered her own dog or something. And it's like, yeah, I mean, I think that's symptomatic of like some scatteredness of like, can you understand that voters don't like that sort of thing? And you wrote about it in a memoir. And I just, the far right, I don't really know what to, and it makes me wonder, what's the mentality like on there? And like, do they think they're contributing to a struggle or something? Or do they just sit back and let the state do shit? I mean, I just don't understand, dude. Like,
I don't know what it's hard to say. I think they're actually they also feel in disarray because I can tell you that even that at the time in the aughts and early aught teens, the one thing I heard all the time was that the right is unified, the left is not.
Right.
And I always was laughing at that because I was like, you do realize during the Bush administration, there was an entire insurgent right that kind of won, but it took them a decade and a half to win. And that is like, the paleo conservative, national conservative renaissance thing. Like Trump really did put them back into history. Like, even though Trump wasn't one of them, he isn't. Like, he's not that coherent. They're now relevant again in a way that they were absolutely not during the Reagan coalition period. They were the people who lost out of the Reagan coalition, initially in and got increasingly pushed out as neoconservatives came to power, because paleo conservatives are distrustful of war. They're not peaceniks, don't confuse it, but they're distrustful of war. They're distrustful of free trade, and they're okay with the right kinds of people getting some social welfare if it also means that they can maybe eventually go back to the gold standard. It's bizarre, but that's where they're at. And in the early aught teens, I mean, some of those guys were even going so far as to endorse Obama because they were so mad at Trump. I mean, if you go back and read like the American Conservative, which like a couple months ago published Why Not Trump 2028, why not Trump forever, basically, which also indicates to me that it's not just that these people want to end American democracy as we know it. They also don't have a backbench. They don't have a a view of social reproduction. But this stuff with Colombia made me realize none of the elites do. Like, if the elites are attacking their own kids in this way, that's an elite crisis. It's a crisis of elite overproduction, but it's also a crisis of their inability to socially reproduce their values as attractive even to their own children of privilege. And that is an interesting scatteredness. You'd think the left, and in some ways the left is able to take advantage of this on this one issue. The thing is, we're going to run flat into the wall of, are you really willing to let the Democrats lose to do this? Because you know that Trump's not going to back down on any of this stuff. In fact, Trump would have been like, oh, we needed a smaller police response, but we needed it earlier. We should have arrested these leaders for early on. Like, and it's hard to know what Trump would do on Israel Palestine because he's not an ideologue. Like, I can't predict what he'd do, honestly. Like, I'm like, he might double down on Netanyahu shit, but he also might not. We don't know. He's actually done both in the past, depending on what's going on. So it's very hard to say. I mean, one of the things I think you'll start hearing is left critiques of Joe Biden are beginning to penetrate into the right as well. And the response to Zionism is doing two things. I think it's dividing Catholics and Protestants on the right. So the Catholics and Protestants have largely been on the same side, but Protestants are probably unwilling to give up their Christian Zionism. That said, I'll also say Christian Zionist institutions and whatnot are in free fall. They really are like the right not being able to come to a unified position on this, and it being divided up amongst religious and ethnic identities amongst themselves on how they should respond to this actually does indicate that they're more deeply fragmented than even probably we know. And yet, it doesn't look like we're going to be able to pivot this into anything. And I'm going to say something that's going to make it's going to be maybe a little hard for people to hear. Protest, by and large, since May 68, have not worked for anything that we've said that they were going to work for. They might have some other purposes, like social solidarity, that kind of thing. There's reasons to do them, but the idea that a protest is going to stop even the funding for a war, much less stop a war, seems to me to just ignore the second half of the 20th century entirely. For like a few movements that happened in the context of trying to establish peace right after World War II, when people were being more generous about what they were going to allow because they wanted to maintain peace and not risk another world war. And I think that's kind of being missed here. Because I have been like, okay, so you get these universities to divest, all right? Who's buying Israeli software? Not so much the Russian government anymore because of sanctions, although they still buy a good bit. The Chinese government, although the Chinese are finally beginning to weigh in on trying to encourage Fatah and Hamas to form some kind of united front. But the Chinese government, they're never going to fully oppose Israel. They buy too much Israeli software for their surveillance technology. The U.S. government, particularly the military, like it's not like South Africa in that its primary exports are not. Yes, there's a lot of consumer goods that are tied into Israel, but a lot of what Israel's economy is like military and surveillance software. So that both is a reflection of the kind of the state, what it is and what it does. I mean, and the other thing that makes Israel difficult, and this is going to probably be slightly unpopular too, is that despite what the U.S. left seems to think, the vast majority of Israeli citizens do not belong to another state. I think something like 70% of them are Israeli only. A little over 50% of them are Mizrahi or Sephardic that were kicked out of the Middle Eastern nations during national consolidation, so they're stateless. So while this is a settler colonial conflict, it is not something you can model on Algeria, because it's also a settler colonial conflict where the settler side also doesn't really have another state to go back to, even if it is serving the interest of various other imperial states, which means that the conditions of war are nastier. And I don't think people really. I think actually some right wing anti Zionists understand this a lot better than left wing anti Zionists do. And this is going to be something that's going to be hard to die down. I'm not saying, however, that we shouldn't be dying this shit down, because like, if we don't start pushing back on some political solution to Israel Palestine, you're going to see 500,000 Palestinians dead by the end of the year. Like, you know, I mean, like, which by the way will be a fourth of the Gazan population. Like, we're already at probably 2% in 6 months, but the starvation is going to really start kicking in soon. Right. So,
yeah.
I mean, and so if people wonder why I'm dark lately, like, we haven't seen atrocities like this since right after World War II. I mean, like, I guess there have been some. I mean, you could talk about Cambodia and some other things that have pretty close to this high of population devastation. But even during the War on Terror, the only thing that approaches this is the Syrian civil war. And that was worse, but that also has gone on for, you know, over a decade. And so, you know, I think that's, you know, that's a dark place to be. And it's also hard to imagine how you pivot an entire social movement off of this one thing in Gaza, because eventually it's going to get settled one way or the other. And then what do you do? And I'm also one of these people who definitely says, like, as communists, we should have something to say about what's going on in Israel, Gaza, about colonialism, about settlerism, etc. But I don't think you can easily pivot back to domestic norms using the same language. I just don't think it's easy to do that. And also, it immediately evaporates the support you might have on Gaza. So we have to ask ourselves a question sometimes when organizing this. And I tell you where I land. But I land on, we support the Gazans even if it doesn't necessarily in the short run help communism, because it's the right fucking thing to do to stop a massacre. Sure. But does it increase the freedom of the global proletariat? No, it doesn't. And I know people don't like that. They don't like to hear that, because they have to believe that your politics need to be coherent in that way. But I don't know that this actually translates to many victories for the working class worldwide.
Yeah, that's rough, man. That's I feel that. You know, I had some thoughts recently about how with the United States does not adhere to any of the International Criminal Court stuff, right? Like they
never.
Yeah, never, right? Never, right? And Israel as well. And we have like a law where, like, even if one of our people is held by the International Criminal Court, we have authorization to use military force to go retrieve them or something.
Yeah. What was crazy is that's also early. So we helped draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is what the International Criminal Court is supposed to enforce.
Right.
But even back then, and I guess it makes sense because we put stuff, if you like look at what like the FDR administration through Eleanor was putting in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it was also pretty clear that we never met it, like, because know we're writing it in the 40s. Right. Freedom of movement and full enfranchisement are the two of those human rights. Jim Crow's still fucking going on.
Yeah. So like, my thoughts recently upon, so I mean, I've been taking a lot of John Mearsheimer and listening to like the realist school of thoughts things, and it all kind of just comes down to fucking might makes right, and whoever has power is going to use it to enforce it, and that's just the sort of grand political geopolitical poker game where everybody's cheating, and it got me to thinking about how, like, we had conversation at some point about how, like, communists, at least in the West, have a rather limited worldview and don't have a sort of design and purpose for their versions of communism beyond free college and Medicare for all and stuff like that. And the question of, like, does the Gaza situation, to do any victories there translate towards anything useful or a victory for the working class internationally? I mean, I would say that, yeah, I mean, stopping a master would be a victory, but what end towards, like, I don't know if we want to call it the dictatorship proletariat or something like that. I mean, it's hard to say, but I would say that I think that maybe an interesting thread to pull would be, like, what would the world look like with every nation state only existing if it submits to an international criminal court? And is that even something that we could dream of? Because it's our country really that is, like, the one that is, like, just the force to be reckoned with, that doesn't comply with it, that is enabling another, like, it's the problem is much deeper than Netanyahu. The problem is much deeper than Israel. The problem is the American empire.
Yeah.
And so, like,
it's the American empire first and foremost, but I would even go further than that.
What's that?
It's also all the empires that are also looming. I mean, like, I recently did a video on the history of multipolarity, which is actually which is from the realist school, and I was pointing out how different that vision is from what Lenin actually advocated. But I've also said, like, there could be something like a communist recognition of the reality of multipolarity, because I also think it's like I think multipolar order is actually the default order of the world. What makes it complicated is that while markets have always been kind of global, they really truly are global, and nobody, including China, Vietnam, whatever, can actually discipline all of the market. They might be able to discipline their own capitalists, but they're still subsumed to the international market. They still have to operate under international market norms, and attempts to get around that are even established just another set of market norms, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, have largely collapsed. And so one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, like, you mentioned without the Soviet Union, one question that I have, and I say this as a person who's kind of defensist on China. So, like,
sure.
I'm like, hands off fucking China. Don't start a global nuclear war with China. That's fucking stupid. But even I've sort of been like, we have to admit that after the Sino-Soviet split, that the Chinese never establishing anything like an international at all is a world historic failure. Like, and they do not seem interested in that. Like, they still don't seem interested in that. The Belt and Road Initiative, what it was not an international. It was a Marshall Plan without a war for setting up an alternative trade network to get around the deep water network of the United States. But that's not really an international. Like, yes, it involves multiple countries, but there's nothing that, like, this is not about the global vision of communism at all. Like, so we have to ask ourselves, okay, we should be defending certain actually existing communist states within reason, as long as they're not killing communists or whatever.
I also wonder, like, what are they going to reach out to Vietnam and Laos and Cuba, and that's that? I mean, it's like, at least the Soviet Union and China, maybe there's more reason and it's wiser to form an international, but China on their own, with forming an international with these smaller countries that are, I don't know that it's, I feel like, Z and his wisdom as a Marxist, I mean, maybe that's within his purview, and he's just kind of like, we'll take care of Chinese citizens, lead out the U.S. through their economy, and make them completely reliant upon us, and we'll just wait things out, possibly.
Yeah, the problem that they have is that's being undone.
Yeah,
like the major U.S. trade partner right now for global production is Mexico. It is not. I mean, it's AMLO's Mexico. It is not used China. That's a shift over an otherwise 30-year norm. It's really slowed down the Chinese economy, and both sides have a demographic bomb Ours is blowing up now. Theirs is going to blow up in about 5 years. And I don't think it's a bit like the Peter Zions of the world and the, you know, and the conservatives like, oh, it's going to destroy China. I'm like, we don't know what it's going to do. We haven't seen, like, this will be the first time in history that basically we're going to see like millions of people just die of old age in a very relatively short amount of time. Like, that has not happened for most of human history. Usually there's some catastrophe that doesn't allow that to happen. It's about to happen. All right. We don't know what it means. I don't know what it means either. And so one of the things about this Gen Z left that I've been pushing on a little bit is like, we're doubling down on the past, and like, yes, we can learn from the past. Yes, we can learn from Russia. Yes, we can, like, from classical, you know, Soviet Union. From, I think we can also learn from the Mexican Revolution, etc. At the same token, we are in entirely different conditions, and even though a lot of times I say, well, geopolitically right now it's a lot closer to 1870 to 1914 than it is to most of the 20th century, right? And I still believe that. But let's add the elephant in the room, though. And in the 1870s, no one had fucking nukes. Like, and that our drones, our chemical weapons, like the killing capacity of these states was a lot, but it is not what it is now. And that completely changes the calculus of what these things look like. And then let's flip back to whatever's happening right now. I am of the opinion that neoliberalism, as we understood it from say 81 to 2007, has actually been dead most of the time. The United States left has been talking about it. That the moment we started getting into like quantitative easing stuff, something had fundamentally shifted. But since it doesn't look like anything familiar to us, and it still has a lot of the same bullshit traits of neoliberalism, we also we haven't periodized it as something separate. And that's leading us to not really understand what is happening in regards to the economy, because I don't think a lot of us saw that, you know, after COVID, we were going to head into a pretty big inflation. A lot of us thought that we were heading into an inflation right before COVID. I did. I mean, not inflation, recession. Mm-hmm. That we were heading into a recession just before COVID, and that COVID actually probably both exacerbated it, but by exacerbating it, also starved it off. So like basically we went through the entire business cycle very quickly, hidden in the COVID numbers. But I have also felt like I don't know what's going on economically anymore. I mean, the U.S. has the same GDP as China, and yet we're stagnating because yes, every rich Democrat that I know will say like, well, the economy is doing good right now. And then I'm like, okay, well, it is doing good in the sense that it has a relatively high GDP. And in fact, we have a high GDP or slightly higher than China, which has been unheard of for most of the end of the 20th century, and most of the 21st century too. Yet it also very much feels like that's not mattering for the average person at all, even more than it didn't matter during the long recovery after Great Recession. So like in the long recovery after Great Recession, I don't think people started feeling good about their economic situation until like 2017. And you know, technically the recovery started in 2011. It took that long. And this one I felt like, well, we all hear all the time the economy is doing good, and yet also we all know that like food inflation's out of control, housing inflation's out of control. The things that we used to care about, yes, schooling and healthcare inflation have slowed, but that's because people don't even utilize the services right now, like for a variety of reasons. Basically, the healthcare scenario is frozen. There's been something we haven't even been talking about. The Biden administration has been decreasing Medicaid and Medicare payouts this entire time. So like it's getting harder and harder for some of these hospitals to make ends meet with staffing, like balancing out Medicare and Medicaid and still paying off the fucking shareholders, which of course they have to do. there's a lot of fictitious capital around that was, some of it's been destroyed, but people might wonder what I mean by that. Fictitious capital is capital that like shows up in the valuation of assets, but you can't actually access, because if you were actually to put the thing on the market, it wouldn't sell for that. So you can't actually valorize all that capital. So some of that capital is just created by asset valuation, and if you're actually to try to sell it, it's not real. We're seeing a lot of that. Like the weird exception though is housing, because housing's become it's become a safety investment. All right, which is a disaster for the average person. So like right now, you can put a house in the market, it'll blue book for 700,000, got like a 5% interest rate, and people are like, oh, the 5% interest rate's not high, and I'm like, yeah, except that when you guys were talking, last time we had like 10, 11, 12, 13% interest, housing values were like on average $40,000 or less. Like, you know, 5% of, even adjusting for inflation, 5% of like $700,000 is a fuck lot more.
Well, adding to the overall don't know what the hell's going on with the economy thing is the guy that self-immolated talking about how cryptocurrency was a giant Ponzi scheme. I mean, I've given thought to where, like, I don't know if this country and its institutions can withstand the crypto market when it finally does collapse, and how many, libertarians are going to turn full on fascist when that happens.
Right, we've already begun to see it. I mean, because
Yeah,
we've seen minor cracks in it that almost took out whole banks.
and combine that with sports betting. The way that, like, even players are getting fined for sports betting now in the NBA, and how, like, I feel like sports in general has tried to keep itself distant from betting because of things like that, which might jeopardize the integrity of the game. But when you have celebrities advertising cryptocurrency stuff in the middle of the Super Bowl, it was only a matter of time before sports betting came into advertisement within, professional sports as well. I just really don't think it's a good sign that part of the economy now is like sports betting and gambling, and how maybe we're just seeing the start of this particular disease, and it's gonna get worse on that front. But yeah, like, I don't really. How is the economy doing? Well, I mean, everyone can't afford to live, and food inflation is ridiculous, and everyone's paying more for everything. It's like I
And that inflation is still, even though it's gone down, it's still outstripping wage increases. So why we saw a bunch of big wage increases for the low. So here's what also people didn't notice: we saw wage increases for the lower part of the workers, which is good. But you know who it came off the backs of? Lower middle workers. So like the people in the like 50K range, they have stalled this entire period. And I mean, the other thing is just like the inflation is really like the consequences of it's really hitting when I like think about like in 1982, I think $40,000 would today be the equivalent of $170,000. And yet I have a hard time imagining people even in the $170,000 range being able to buy a house. Whereas in 1982 or even in the 90s, you could buy a house if you could come up with a down payment on just above minimum wage, right? Like if you were working full time and minimum wage, and you had another person in your household working even part-time, you could probably pull off a house. I can't imagine like trying to even rent on minimum wage as a single family. Like it's not possible. Now, on one hand, Americans are weird in that, like, we were buying houses when people in Europe and stuff. I had Europeans who get mad at me, like, "Oh, you have these giant houses." I'm like, "We also have more land, guys. Like, there's just a lot more. Like, it's different." I realize this quality of life, it feels pretty extravagant when you're from like a European city and you're used to a flat being 2 bedrooms and it costing a ridiculous amount of money. But the United States' housing market now is like not viable. The rent's gotten a little better. Rent inflation has kind of slowed down, but it hasn't gone down because now so few people can buy houses that it's a backstop. So while rent isn't continuing to go up because we're throwing housing stock up as fast as we can in a lot of places, it still is not going to make up. Like it's still not going to go down because there's still so much more demand because people can't buy houses. It's out of the possibility for them. The left, however, isn't talking about that at all. I mean, like at all. Like it's. I mean, yes, leftist individual are like talking about the economy, but like I haven't seen a plan come out on housing for anybody. Like Jackman hasn't done like new housing issue. Like it's just not. The DSA still like pretended that it cared about Medicaid. I mean, I'm sure the individual people cared about Medicaid for all, but but when I saw the chunks of money they could throw at it, like, like, oh, we need to control the electeds. I'm like, you can give an elected $7,000 as a grant.
Right.
Like a city council position in Salt Lake City can run you $200K to try to run for. Like, do you think a grant of $7,000 is going to matter in that scenario? Particularly when you consider the DSA's concentration is also the same concentration as the historical. This was funny. I didn't know this until recently. While socialists were very popular in the Midwest, and actually even in the 50s, the Midwestern colleges were the least affected by the Red Scare because they just wouldn't go all that. They wouldn't go there, interestingly. The concentration of the Communist Party was still primarily in California and New York, even in the 40s, which is interesting. I don't know what to make of that because that, like, today it makes sense because of like relative population. There's just a lot, like 17% of all economic transactions happen in New York or California. Like it's quite a bit. But weirdly, if you think about the 1940s, that was not true. There are still a lot of big cities in other parts of the country that had not yet declined. And so it is interesting to me that like there's a long historical relationship between the two coasts and radical politics that I don't really understand, but also seems to indicate that this idea that they were largely working class even in the early 20th century is just not true. Like, they weren't mostly university students because university students before the GI Bill were like 2% of the population or something. It was tiny. So I guess to take it back to more black pill stuff, and I'm going to ask your opinion about this. One of the interesting things about 68, I've been thinking a lot about cycles and how they rhyme and where they don't. All right.
Yeah.
So 68, this looks a lot like 68. Foreign intervention, although it's not a war we're directly in, it's a war we're indirectly in or quasi directly in, but we're not legally directly in it in any capacity. But who knows? There is a nightmare scenario where someone shoots the wrong person. All of a sudden, American troops are killing Gazans too, and maybe Iranians.
Well, I mean, all of this is like, I mean, the student campuses and stuff. I mean, we live in a country where there's a mass shooting every day. Like it's like any of this has a potential to just be a tinderbox. Like it's.
I'm actually surprised. I'm going to say this is crazy. I'm surprised how few political assassinations we've actually seen since 2020. Because in a lot of ways, that's another difference between us and 68. And 68, a lot more people were actually dying. Including high profile political figures in the United States. I mean, one of the strange things about the U.S. versus France is we think of France as more radical, but the U.S. fallout from the post DNC convention was actually way more violent, and it led to a spread. Like there were assassinations for years after that.
Mm.
Like, uh, then there was the entire new left slash early new communist movement bombing campaigns, like which didn't kill anybody other than themselves. Um, because they weren't trying to they were terrorism light, which was always interesting because I'm always like, when in America, when leftists do terrorism, they like blow themselves up and cause a lot of property damage, and when rightists do terrorism, they kill their enemies and maybe some innocent people too. Like it always has, which is not to say that we should be like the right. That's not what I'm saying here. It's just always been interesting to me, that comparison, because I'm like, oh, so in the '60s, the weathermen like blew up their own cars and caused like did 200 bombings that caused a lot of property damage, and then like the Klan blew up churches with people in them.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of a different thing. So when people hear that equated, but we do feel like we're entering days of lead period, which is not even a civil war. It's like low key violence all the time in a highly politically unstable situation, where
My mind,
nobody
yeah.
can really do anything either. They other than get at each other. Like
I mean, it reminds me of like Christmas Day a few years back. There was a bomb in the middle of Nashville, like a car bomb. Guy that just ignited this bomb, and it made the news, but a lot of us were just like, so we're just gonna like move past this. No one's gonna talk about this.
it was very weird how little discourse there was around that car bomb.
Yeah,
Like
and
it
and
was.
so when you talk about like just kind of pervasive violence all the time, I mean, it's self-immolation is on the rise. What can I say? I mean, it's rare that we. I mean, I think the last one I remember, there was a guy who I think he set himself on fire on the White House lawn or
Mhm.
something.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah, and so I mean, I take note of these as sort of like canary in the coal mine for society, and uh, we have active, Aaron Bushnell, active military member, self-immolating.
And he isn't the first one. I mean, there's some
Yeah,
during the Iraq War protest, but again, we've been normalized to it. Like, it's one of the things that I have recently. I was on this. Oh well, they suppress Black Lives Matter less than they suppress these student uprising, and then I went back and actually like looked at it, and I'm like, it depends on the time period that we're talking about in 2020 on how suppressed BLM was, because there were points where they were just like throwing tear gas even in rich neighborhoods without caring that it even got rich people tear gassed by standards. So they weren't that light on it. But it did seem like it took a lot more to get the Dems to turn on that than this. Like this was almost immediate. Like,
well, isn't it time for the liberals to wake up, man? I mean, it seems like they went dormant when Biden won. They woke up when Trump's first campaign was a threat, and we all knew they'd go back to sleep after Biden won. But it seems like we're missing some characters in the story right now.
well, yeah. I got a question for you. What are we
Yeah,
gonna
man.
do when the left has to go on its anti Trump? Is it too exhausted to do that? Is it not going to take the bait this time? Like I am already seeing certain young activists in the older Gen Z cohort begin to be like, well, even though 70% of the population wants a third party, it can never happen because it's divided over what it would be. And look at these candidates, we can't vote for them. And I'm always like, why do you think that voting for a third party is like something you do tomorrow that you can just go in and do by voting tomorrow? Like you'd have to build the social infrastructure. You got to take time. It's going to require law changes, etc. And is it probably going to require like insurrectionary force as well to really like on the state level to really get states to take it seriously. And that's a long game. I mean, it's not it's not forever, but it's a long game. Whereas you seem to think that we should just be able to go in and vote for someone, and that's the end all be all of politics. Which to me is like, did you miss the lesson of the last 4 years? Like,
Yeah, I mean, some people take it as a starting point. Some people take it as a very like bare minimum. I take it as like at this point now, like I mean, I never voted anyway, man. Uh, but I'm hearing more and more from people I wouldn't describe as disenfranchised, just as people as like that are kind of like taking just an honest view and assessment of what's going on in the world, and it's like, you want me to vote for that? You told me to vote for the guy who designed the prison industrial system, kind of thing. You told me, to vote for the guy who was going to do better by immigrants. I mean, he told me the guy that to vote for the guy that wasn't going to start wars, but I mean, he's effectively responsible for a genocide at this point. And so it just seems like there's a lot the Democratic Party can ask of us, but asking us to continue voting for a guy who's arming a genocide against a population that's half children. One of the strongest sort of retorts I found to this was the TikTok video where the guy was like, all right, you want me to vote for a Democrat? Vote blue? You want me to vote blue in November? Okay, but do something for me, right? Kill your children. Like, go and kill your children and hold their, bodies there and then tell me that it was worth it for this vote, that, because the world's going to end if we don't vote for Biden or something. It's essentially, it's like, saying vote for Biden and the continued murdering of children in Gaza. And, I thought it was obviously a little exaggerated sort of, metaphor, but it was something that kind of was like, yeah, maybe this is a bridge too far, asking Gen Z to vote for. I mean, if you're Gen Z and you vote for Biden, you're just, I don't even know what to say, man. Like at this point.
I mean, it's funny watching it happen. The other thing that's happened is that Gen Z is less progressive in some ways. I'm going to put a big caveat: in some ways, by gender. Also, another caveat, than the millennials were, because their first experience of politics is a very unpopular Democratic president. Right? It's not that they're becoming reactionaries. It's just like they just don't care anymore. Like, they might care now that TikTok's being taken away. I know that sounds flippant, and maybe it won't. Maybe some company will buy it and it'll be okay. But it looks like right now that its most likely outcome is to be shut down in the United States. Which, they say security, I say sounds like protectionism to me, but we're all doing that these days.
Well, I mean, I think that perhaps TikTok is largely responsible for the reason why we are all somewhat paying attention to a degree to Gaza, and that somebody can pick up their phone and actually have an algorithm expose their voice. It's the reason why music artists are all flocking over to TikTok, because everything else has been, I mean, even dating apps at this point are like, you can't really effectively use them unless you pay for them. Facebook is like, you can't even mention Palestine without it suppressing your stuff. It's like everything has been engineered to not work in the way that you'd expect it to. But TikTok is the only thing left where people actually get exposure. And,
well, here's the funny thing about Facebook, though. That shit was outdone by liberal request with a lot of the left backing it up. Like,
that is really funny too. Yeah, I mean, but if you're Ben Shapiro, you're still getting millions of hits and your stuff, and Facebook is still feeding you right.
No, I actually, ironically, I've even seen Facebook feed me anti-Semitic stuff going under the guise of of anti-Palestinian war stuff, but it has just come out blatantly, and yet if I mean, I think about how censored in some way, like this whole weird way Gen Z has of talking, which is partly around getting around Instagram, YouTube, and yes, TikTok's censorship functions. Like like all those weird kind of cutesy things like unalive, ha ha ha. That's all related to talking on the way you have to talk on social media now. The dark irony is, though, because no one wants, and the reason why this is no one wants to actually put in the man labor to actually moderate shit. Like, let's be honest, they use all these algorithms that are really stupid. Because if you get rid of this,
we're all going to have to learn how to speak anti-AI or how to speak around or code wise. I mean, at this point now, if AI, what we have obviously is not the same AI that the military has, the police have, that we're probably dealing with live transcription shit out in protest now, like tools
you
that
absolutely are.
yeah, like we have to learn. We're all going to have to learn how to speak and code to get around this stuff.
And unfortunately, I will say this: younger millennials and Gen Z have been, other than this code speak, they've actually been trained to overshare.
Yeah.
And I mean in a way that like compromises them later on after after a protest or what. Sometimes it helps. I mean, like for example, that attack on UC California that happened yesterday night, by those Zionists. If any of those people are caught, it's going to be because they put their faces on openly on things like Instagram, YouTube, and Telegram. But a lot of people just don't seem to grok it anymore. Facial recognition's everywhere. Your phone is spying on you 100% of the time, and liberals, and this is liberals, have normalized, well, maybe privacy wasn't needed anyway.
Right.
Like, I hear that from liberals more than conservatives. Although conservatives have kind of been on that train for a while. The other thing that the left has done that I've been really wary of is like being inconsistent on their stance towards police and encouraging, like, I don't know, terror charges and stuff principally. And I'm like, don't do that. That's going to be used on you. And people are like, oh, we have to use the stuff at the hand, And I'm like, I don't think so, man. I don't think it's gonna go well for you. Which is not to say that I'm also not one of these people who thinks the center doesn't come down on the right. Sometimes they do. There's COINTELPRO all over right-wing organizations. We know that they keep on baiting people into militias into doing stupid shit. But we know if they're there, we also know they're here. Like I used to joke about 10, 15 years ago that we know the left was back when there's COINTELPRO again, and I don't know that there's COINTELPRO again, but I will not be surprised that in 30, 40 years when stuff gets declassified that we find out that like some of these parties are like a temp feds. Like it would not surprise me at all. Like,
yeah, I mean,
and they might not even be fed people. They may be fed fucking AI scripts. Like that's the thing. Now you don't like if you're not interacting with people directly, you don't even know that you're interacting with a fucking person all the time. Like, I don't think the AI is that good yet, but we're not that far from it. So, I mean,
yeah, I mean, I think you and I had a conversation once where you were talking about streamers are cheap, man. You can buy a streamer if you're a country with funding and interested in soft power and shit, and we are seeing
very cheap.
So seeing things like I don't know, like Norm Finkelstein not being able to talk because of people like Haas or something, and Jackson Hinkle out at these protests on campus. It's a dark time, dude. It's a really dark time, and I think about these students out there, and I, talking of all the things we've talked about today that don't translate into sort of any sort of tangible victories or results, or it did hearten me to see that some Gazans had written like thank you to university students, and who knows? I'm choosing to believe that's an authentic image. It could be AI, it could be something fucking made, but
I think
but
it's
that's
real.
really cool. I think it's real. Yeah,
just like the Vietnamese government put up a statue to American anti-war protesters. Did they matter? I don't know, but
right.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this for a while because for me the question has become, and I want to get your opinion on this. Maybe this is another thing that we could talk about a little bit about places that are both dark but also maybe tell us something that we can take advantage of. I think we all kind of fear that protests don't really work for what they say on the tin. I don't know any leftist who's like protest. Every now and then people will tell me that like BDS worked in South Africa, and I'm like, yeah, but so did a lot of other stuff, like an armed insurrection, the the Bush senior administration getting the South African government to give up its nuclear weapons, et cetera, et cetera. A bunch of stuff had to happen. Also, the Soviet Union was still around. So like, there's a bunch of stuff. But it does seem interesting to me, and I mean this in a way that's both that I said in the beginning, that the state seems both stronger and weaker. And the ways it seems stronger is that it's like between the two BLM insurrections over a decade and Occupy and various campus protests and the anti-war movement in the aughts, they've gotten very good at breaking up these kinds of things without using a lot of hard power, right? They're using a lot of hard power. Like, so, and they're using the soft power stuff. I mean, I'm sure some of these protests will never see jail time, but I can see a lot of the leadership being brought up on federal charges. I can see these universities being punished by denies of student visas becoming a real thing, which I think is actually maybe a little bit of what's driving, in addition to being invested into this stuff. It was interesting watching these admins speak very wokely a year ago and totally reverse now. And I think that has to do with the fact that they are hyper invested in this war machines, and unlike the BLM stuff, this actually requires you to do something. The weird thing about the BLM demands is they were in some ways very specific, and in other ways so vague they weren't possible. Like no one's defunding all the police. That doesn't make any sense. As a demand, I always like you either go all the way and call for abolishment and reestablishing a whole new police force, or a whole new, you don't call it a police force, do what civil, or you don't do it. Like, right. You go back onto like humane reforms, because like just taking away their money is like taking away the money from the people with all the fucking guns, and then like, but we have your money now, and they're like, but we have your guns. I don't know how that doesn't seem obvious to people why that would be a problem. Like,
do you think that if the goal is divestment, or the goal of the student protests is like end the genocide, right? I mean, do you think that the goal or the anchor point of that goal serves the protesters well in the articulation of that goal? Like is that something that they, like, in the same way you say go all the way with abolition and reforming something else entirely, like is it a similar goal that they can work towards, or is this just something that you think is kind of along the same lines of vagueness?
It's kind of vague. I mean, for one instance, like I've heard people say we want a ceasefire and a global intifada, and I'm like, you're not getting both.
Yeah.
Like I'm sorry, no state on the earth is going to be like global intifada. We're putting our guns down now. Like,
well, this is like, I asked this, like, it goes back to what I was saying about like, what would a world look like where everyone submitted to sort of global order of something similar to an ICC? I wonder if maybe the answer is, I mean, obviously part of it is like, in terms of a global vision is, I go as far as saying, hey, we need to end the U.S. empire. And,
of course.
You say, of course, in the conversations I have, people get, very upset.
Well, I mean, I don't think people know what that means, though, because there's all kinds of binds. One, most of the social democratic programs is actually dependent on fairly loose currency. Loose currency is dependent on people taking that currency. The people taking that currency is dependent on two things: productive capacity, which we still have. I know people think we don't, but we really do. But the other big reason is we have a lot of fucking guns. We have more guns than the world has ever seen, in about every way you can talk about it. This is the most armed society that's ever existed on the fucking earth, ever. I mean, like I don't think people really understand the scale sometimes, and I'm like, no, the U.S. military is a military force, the likes of which, even adjusting for the size of the population of the world has never seen before. Like, there has been no military with that much of a very rich society's wealth directly invested into it that wasn't doing direct extraction in this way. And it wasn't a fully militarized society, because that's the other thing about U.S. society that's really weird. We are not a militarized society. We're a society that's dependent on a giant military.
Yeah.
Which, and that puts us in a weird situation. Like, because one of the things about the incoherence of the end of the millennial left was like this idea that we could return to normalcy, like, and I was like, but normalcy is the U.S. empire.
Yeah.
Like, that's, and even the warmongers themselves seem to think that, at least a faction of them seem to think that it's time to Hadrian's Wall this and be like, okay, we got our empire. You know what? We're gonna accept multipolarity, and we'll even play with the Russians. You know what? We're gonna play with the Russians so we can fuck the Chinese. That's what we're gonna do. Like,
well, it's not even fucking an option, dude. I mean, it's like, we're not going to be friends with Russia.
That ship is shown. I mean,
that ship is
a
gone,
lot of
dude.
a lot of conservatives wanted, even Mearsheimer wants it,
right?
But it's not going to happen. They will never trust us again. To be fair, what reasons have we given them? I mean, and also, I'm also with you. I don't necessarily think it would be a progressive for the world for us to be working with Putin over working with Xi and dividing that world up either. Like, I think that what I think has happened with the U.S. left, is the other thing that happened during the Trump years and the Bernie Social Democratic years is we quit keeping up with what was going on abroad. Like, the left in America from the 60s to the 90s was mostly a foreign policy related left, which is also a problem. And I'm not saying that's a good in and of itself. All right. But apparently, since we cannot walk and chew bubblegum at the same time, when we realized that, that was a problem, like how much did you hear about the Afghan war during 2016 to 2019? Hardly anything.
Right. This shit disappeared, man. Yeah, it became the always war. Like, we were always in Afghanistan. We were always waging a war, and it became background noise and a way of just operating and existing. And maybe that's just what happens when you spend like 70 years at war, at constant war, and never on the moral end of a war since World War II. I mean, we are a warring state, dude. And, a lot of, it's kind of like my friend David Parsons said once that when he was teaching in 2001 when Abu Ghraib or around that time happened, it was like students were outraged to learn that the United States were torturing, their prisoners of war. 20 years later, students would be like, hey, did you know the U.S., tortures its prisoners of war? And students were like, yeah, no shit.
Yeah, it's all been normalized now. I mean,
it's all been normalized. Yeah.
And what's interesting about that is, I was thinking about this the other day. I did a show on the Uncommitted campaign, and I was talking about, the best, how we're winning so many right wingers. It's not what the activists are doing. Honestly, it's the IDF TikTok. Like,
right.
And I said that because I'm like, because we used to, like, WikiLeaks would show things and it would be scandalous, right? Or Abu Ghraib would happen, it would be scandalous, and it was like shit that the IDF puts on TikTok for itself.
Yeah.
For the whole world to fucking see. They don't care anymore. And that is different. That is a fundamental change where it's like, like everything's gotten to the point of like no one's hiding. And in one case, I think it's good that we don't have the naivete about the U.S. government anymore. On the other hand, it's like we've also just sort of accepted that this is the way things are. Like,
and it's also like, yeah, we've accepted this is the way things are, and we're also a country that doesn't sign on to the International Criminal Court, and we are, for all intents and purposes, acting like we're in a unipolar, moment, and I think that the normalization, it's different when you got a 3-bedroom house with air conditioning, when you're looking upon the normalization of grotesque violence perpetrated by the country that you're a part of, upon people that you'll never meet and never see. And it becomes quite easy just to be like, no shit, we torture.
The other thing that's happened since the Russia-Ukraine war and maybe even the Syrian civil war And I'm not saying this as I'm not a fan of any side of any of these wars, but like,
Mm-hmm.
let's be quite frank here. Um, we're also 2 steps removed. Like, it's a lot harder to have a peace movement when the peace movement's like, stop this other country from doing a war.
Yeah.
Like, it's so, and yes, I think it's interesting that actually, one thing I might say that maybe you might find complicating,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how you would feel about it, is this idea that we may be in a moment of where we are both acting unipolarly and multipolarly at the same time. And so we're acting in regards to the international courts and all that, it's like a unipolar power. And effectively we are. I mean, like, I hate to say this, but like in regards to Israel Palestine, Israel has done such a good job at getting beyond just being our puppet under the Netanyahu regime, that
Mm.
they've normalized relations with the Saudis. They've made good until very recently in complications with Iran. They had very good relationships with Russia. They are a major trading partner with China beyond us. Like, um, that that in some ways they both need us and don't. Like, they need our money. They need our weapon systems. But
Well,
we're not.
they're kind of individuating as a sort of narcissistic, behavior comportment of nations wise narcissistic. I mean, they are uh, not really adhering to what we would like them to do and going rogue in certain ways and not letting us know about their, bombing embassies in Damascus. It's like they don't and they do, but it's kind of like we have this crazy teenager that's like experimenting to find out how much power they actually have, how much independence they
Yeah,
actually
yeah,
have. And yeah, and it's very
yeah. I
disrupting,
mean,
obviously. Yeah, yeah,
well, and so I'm with you with that, but the one of the things about a multipolar world, if you go back and read like the
yeah,
Mersheimer literature on this, he points out that like you just have a fuck ton more proxy wars,
yeah, yeah.
and in that sense, instead of us going to war ourselves because it's a little bit too dangerous now that we might actually have to contend with like, okay, we might upset Russia and China, and they actually could actually complicate our day. Um, we now go through agents, but it also seems like some of these agents are independent, are strong enough that we can't totally control them anymore. Like, I've been playing with the idea, and I don't think it's true. I think Biden's also maybe a diehard Catholic Christian, liberal Zionist. Look, I'm not totally sold that he isn't. But I have been playing with an idea a little bit that is that has got me a little bit worried. That part of why the U.S. empire is so unwilling to like even pull the Reagan in '83 about Lebanon, is that it would make it very obvious very quickly, if Israel's like, you know what, we can still kill a bunch of Palestinians without you. In fact, we can just start dropping megaton bombs or something. Like, I don't know that they would do that. The reason why I don't think Israel would do that is actually because it would make the silence of the other Arab nations really hard to do.
Mm,
But one thing that we've seen now is like the U.S. like during the COVID years and with the frustrations of Mohammed bin Salman with the United States like daring to say anything to him, uh, there was some forays made to China with Saudi Arabia, which is why China has kept its mouth shut on Yemen.
mm.
That seems to be over. Like, it seems like the United States and Saudi Arabia are actually on weirdly good terms right now. Um, and uh, yeah, it's just trying to figure this out right now, because it's like, okay, uh, you're talking about the unipolar world, where I have been sort of like, well, where's China and Russia right now? I mean, I get Russia's fighting his own war. I get it, like, fine. But where's China? And China's doing some things to try to mitigate this and calm it down as a neutral arbiter, but they're not coming down like cleanly. Like, we are going to support the Palestinians no matter what. Like, that is not happening. And so I'm wondering where the left's geopolitical narrative is going to go when it's like, who do we have supporting us here? Because I will point out that like the general population of the planet is generally becoming like in favor of the Palestinians for the most part. Um, there are some exceptions. Northern Ireland Protestants apparently are still big fans of the IDF, but in general, it's getting harder and harder for people to not feel sympathy. I mean, because Gaza's like mostly children. Like that's undeniable. Um, Even if you thought that October 7th was unjustified, in no world does the current response make any sense. Even if you're, kind of a hawk on that. Uh, I will say this: liberal Zionism, dead.
Yeah.
It's dead. There's no more liberal Zionism. Like it's over. Um,
I mean, I think, I think I keep going back to like, I think Norman Finkelstein or Noam Chomsky, one of them brought it up. It's like, it comes down to like a historical question of during the course of human events in history, like, is it ever permissible to ethnically cleanse an area on behalf of a certain group of people that have been historically, wronged? And
although not by the people they're ethnically cleansing. So
yeah, it's wild, man. That like, I don't know, man. I agree with Christopher Hedges. Not Chris Hedges. Was it Chris? Chris
Hedges are
no, I'm thinking. I'm drawing it. Hitchens. Yeah. When he said, Israel is a terrible waste of Judaism. It's it's not enough that we're living through like the tail end of the American empire being the richest history in the nation with the most military guns and all this shit, man. We're also watching sort of the undoing of an historical narrative, or we're watching. I don't know where the left narrative goes at this point. I don't know, as far as our effectiveness of methods. I don't know as far as what we do after this, other than no war but class war. And yeah, we got to support the Gazans over. I mean, I don't know, like certainly the communist project has always been up in the air, man. But it's like, yeah, we support Gaza to end the atrocities, to end the massacre.
right.
But yeah, I don't really know where the left goes from here, especially left in the United States. What do we do after 2024 when either Trump or Biden is still in there?
What is it? What do we do with also like all the people that we were sold as our electives have capitulated to all this, and that we like with I'll give Rashida Tlaib her noble exception.
Sure.
Like in some ways she's the exception that proves the rule, though, which makes it in some ways like, well, Rashida, if you really mean it, eventually you have to resign from your party.
You have
I'm
to
sorry,
resign.
like
Yeah.
run as an independent, but even fucking Republicans have done that. So like, but like AOC's betrayal has been etched in from the first moment on, and I was very unpopular for being on the. She's a Ted Kennedy staffer first. Always remember that. Never forget it. Christian Cinema was a Green Party candidate tied to Occupy. Never forget that. Like, Jean Quan was on the far left faction of the Maoists in the 70s. Never fucking forget it. Like, we have produced of our own movement many of these people. The current squad is not even the first round of it. People who are clutching pearls about this don't know their history. Like, this is a long thing. I don't know why you didn't. This has been my frustration about the American left, is that like, oh, it learned the history of the new left after it repeated all this dumb shit.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, okay, you're gonna learn it now that you've already done it and it's too late. Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think we all need to go back and study the history of this stuff. That's why I'm a fan of like Jason's podcast, The Radical Century, and Measures Taken and stuff like that. And I'm not even saying that I have an adequate knowledge base on that history. You know,
I think we're stuck between though, like not knowing our history and then hauntology, where we think we can just revive the history back whole cloth, like, and we
well,
just change what we want to revive. Like, and
and
I don't think
yeah.
either of those are pathways.
Well, I also think that like this is something that I preach a bit about, like, you know, in terms of like if I've had a thought, then I know that somebody else has already had that thought, and I know somebody has written stuff down about thinking along those lines of that thought. And I can go through the history of ideas and find where people wrote down their thoughts that took it further than I ever thought about. And then that becomes a partner in thinking. And why this method isn't applied towards organizing and stuff, uh, you know, I mean, you know what we do is we look at patriotic socialism. We're like, oh, boundarism 2.0, pat on the back, da da da. Let's tweet about it, you know, point it out. But the shit has, you know, implications. It has effects on our
Yeah,
movement.
why
You know,
is Broaderism 2.0 possible at the same time that J. Sakai 2.0 is also possible? Ostensibly within the same ideological movement, even though those people hate each other. Like, they're both Marxist Leninists in some loose, weird sense.
yeah,
Like, to a lesser degree, and I don't consider these people like defectors or traitors like patriotic socialists, but like Midwestern Marx versus like, I don't know, uh, who's doing more woke stuff on the ML. There used to be more, but like, but there's a lot of third worldist, and weirdly, right now, there's even like third worldist on both sides on the woke anti-woke debates, which I've always been like, why are we as communists arguing about the terms of acceptable discourse within liberal discourse societies? Like, this is just not. I mean, like, look, we should care about racism and all that. I'm not even saying all that sounds like I'm diminishing it. It's a super big struggle because it's divided the working class, it's divided the world. Like, it's created haves and have nots in ways that are hard to deal with. We absolutely have to address it, and we should be against it. But at the same time, um, why are we in all this pearl clutching about acceptable discourse languages on Twitter and in academia? Like, what is that really about? That's not. I mean,
well, I
for
mean, the
me, it's like not
discourse.
our fight. Like,
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we have to be alert to some kind of discourses, you know. So when like patriotic socialism comes up and it's trending on Twitter and that stuff catches on, it's like, oh God, we've seen this happen before, and
yes,
we know where it goes, and so stuff
and
like
a lot
that.
of people
Yeah,
didn't take that patriotic socialism stuff seriously until it was pretty popular, right?
yeah. You know, for me, I mean, at least when these things come up, I try to learn from them, and you know, I looked at someone like I mentioned before, like a Frank Meyer, who, you know, and I don't know, man. I feel like I've got to go and sharpen my own ideological blade from time to time, because you want to make sure that, like, because we're all susceptible to some degree or another to ideas, and one has to remain firmly principled in order to reject outright the ideas that will, not in terms of a dogmatic adherence to your ideology, uh, but to a constantly renewed philosophical commitment towards equality, I would say. And your political commitments must be philosophically grounded and morally grounded in such a way that these arguments, when presented to you like patriotic socialism, they just kind of bounce off of you, you know, and you can see them for what they are. And the disappointment in this comes in seeing comrades that you find and take to be morally and philosophically and politically principled, and ultimately they are assuaged much so easily than by ideas like patriotic socialism, and then they get caught in the confirmation bias thing, where like even when you present facts against their stance, it doesn't change their mind.
No, all these
So
things all these mediations are particular. Here's the thing:
yeah,
they're all potentially cargo cults. I mean, this is kind of the way, like, any of these things, including our ideas. I mean, like, to be honest, like, if there was a Varnism right now, I might have to be like, no.
well, I mean, I like your idea of the the not your idea, but when you mention classical Marxists with putting class struggle first versus the sort of anti-imperialist first type of Marxism that has shown itself to be susceptible to Duginism and Eurasianism and multipolarityism, if you can call it that.
Yeah, I
Third
tried to make an
worldism.
ideology out of multipolarity, which is weird to me because I'm like, it's not an ideology. It's
Well,
just like it's
yeah, it doesn't have any
a
political
number of powers.
content. It's
Yeah.
like, yeah. So all that being said, it's like it's taken me back towards understanding why classical Marxism is probably the way to stay, and I have concern about the third world and must be
Absolutely.
anti-imperialist and all that. But I think the moment you start substituting in one prioritizing over the classical teachings of Marx and the approach that way, it can become problematic. I mean,
I will admit on third worldism, the one thing I will say that complicates it is that Marx and Engels are the most unclear on national liberation. Lenin is clear on it, but I don't think Lenin's policies. I think Lenin's policies in the Soviet Union actually have repercussions that we're still dealing with, which is like encouraging nationalisms where they weren't there. And that actually coming back as an anti-Soviet, anti-communist sentiment later on. And if that's a critique of Lenin that I have. It's a reason why when people ask me if I'm a Leninist or a Marxist Leninist, I'm always like hedging my bets because I'm like, well, I think Lenin's the most important Marxist thinker of the 20th century.
Yeah.
And also, unlike many other Marxist thinkers, he actually fucking led a revolution. The most successful revolutionary is actually probably Mao. I don't think Mao's necessarily the greatest Marxist thinker in the world. Nonetheless, those you have to deal with them, and you have to deal with them honestly and fairly, and see what their benefits and hindsights are. And they're also people with their own histories who move around. That's one thing I don't like about the left tendency to turn things into isms. Even like when we talk about Stalinism, is like Stalin in 1927 and Stalin in 1936 and Stalin in 1948 and Stalin in 1952 are all very different. Like,
hey, give me just a second. I'm sorry, man. Give me 5 minutes. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Pause just a moment.
So I don't know what you make of that. When I talk about like these figures, I'm obviously a little bit more skeptical of Uncle Joe than probably you are. I also think even like there's a vulgar anti-Stalinism also that refuses to actually understand the shifts and changes of those policies and like what different ones led to different things, that there are different conditions. Like I've recently done this long piece on Bordiga, and Bordiga, for example, actually, even though he was kicked out of the party by this time, his position is a position that's adopted by the third period, which is only popular fronts only allowed from below. I mean, united fronts only allowed from below, so you can work with non-communist labor unions, but you can't work with non-communist parties, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So like there's this history of and there are other differences between Stalin and Bordiga, but like there's this history in where like you miss the fact that some of these positions are fungible. Or like for example, another thing that make Marxist-Leninists a little bit uncomfortable, but the dekulagization is actually Stalin adopting a policy first advocated by Trotsky. Like which should make Trotskyists deeply uncomfortable because they're always attacking Stalin the most during that time period, and that's the time period where Stalin is pursuing the policy Trotsky advocated for. So unless you think like, oh, it just would have been better because of the guy in charge, it's going to mislead you on the situation. And so I have been very much like, we have to like, I know that Marx recognized all the way back almost 200 years ago that we always start off replaying the past. That's what we do. Like, he talks about like the way in which the early Protestants, which led the English Civil War, were replaying the Bible until they had John Locke and they didn't need to replay the Bible anymore. And you could have Locke versus Hobbes as opposed to Protestant versus Catholic. And he also talks about this in the way that like the French Republic was basically, but when it was first starting, LARPing the Roman Republic. Like it's just, we do that. So I don't want to chastise the left for doing that because it's something that they're going to do because it's something that people do anyway. We look back to the past for models, we dress ourselves in that until we have actually grabbed the future and then or grab the present and then we start living in the present. But at the current, it very much seems to me that the left is kind of in a weird twilight zone where we're, like we said before, we're both stuck in the past, but we don't know our history. That's why it's a ghost, because you also don't recognize it. You can't see it in its own context. You see it as something that's free floating in your context, which is wrong. That's not the way you should be looking at that. And so I get. I'm not here to say left unity rah 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 because there's some people we need to kick the fuck out of the movement. But to a certain degree, I've always want to be like, we need to look at the fact that our problems are going to be our problems. They're not just going to be the problems of even 1968. And 1968 is a fuck lot closer to us than, say, 1914 or 1892 or something like that. So, I mean, I don't know how you're feeling about that, but, I feel torn in both directions because on one hand, I'm always like, learn your history, know your history, take it in, internalize it, but don't try to repeat it. You can't repeat it. You can't just you don't live in that world.
I mean, like I'm sitting here watching, like, the fall of Kabul, like the fall of Saigon, with similar imagery that happened. Was that right before May '68 when that happened?
Yeah,
right. So it's like history is really rhyming right now,
yeah.
and it's in a way that, like, it's not even. I mean, it's some of the high notes that it's rhyming with it, and I don't know exactly what happened after May '68 that could correlate towards possible future events, but I don't know, man. I mean, I tell people to go back and learn history, and why, so you can sit here and watch a slow moving train wreck like with the rest of us, because people are going to repeat that stuff, play it out like you said. I don't know, man. I mean, I go back and I look at history, and this stuff is not surprising to me, and it leads you to being framed as black pilled. You're like, shit, we read about this stuff already. But the title of this episode, on the left between burnout and burnout, is like, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, Bernie got me the second time around, and I thought I was, wise enough to not fall for it, and I got just enough hope to be disappointed again. And it's. I don't think we're actually being tricked. I don't think it's actually the same thing. I think it's just we're watching this happen in real time, and it does correlate, it does rhyme, and I don't think that's entirely lost on the students there either. I mean, I don't think that's lost on a lot of us. I just think that we do need to question more of like what's actually leading to victories and material wins. I don't, like I said, protest. What's that doing for us?
Right.
Like if we think about what did George Floyd get us? Eric Adams and further militarization of, like, what like we have to live through the white lash of it. I'm not saying don't go protest, but like observe and demarcate truthfully what results of those things.
So this is going to give us is black pill is as I'm often accused of being. I want to end on realistic hope versus unrealistic hope, and I think maybe we can talk about realistic hope here. These protests are going to be crushed. I think we all know that. I think they know it. I think the protesters know it. I think they can get some concessions before they're fully crushed and maybe get some stuff done. Maybe, nobody in those protests is going to tell you, hey, we're going to be crushed. Of course not. But they all know the odds. They have to, and if they don't, they'll learn very quickly. That's not the point, though. Like, if you focus on that, you miss the most important stuff after that settled 68 wasn't in 68. It wasn't in the DNC convention. It wasn't in the Sorbonne in France. It was the stuff after, right? And the same was true at Occupy, by the way. That what mattered for Occupy was not the occupations themselves. It was a beginning of a politics. And we can't even say that Occupy totally failed, because Occupy inspired a left that the Democrats felt they at least needed to co-opt, which is actually different. They hadn't felt that way since the 70s. Like, Biden now moving away from the left, like that's been the natural Democratic impulse for most of our lives. Like, there's a brief blip in the second half of the Obama administration, where that's not true.
Right.
Like,
Right.
and then when it's all hands on deck against Trump, which had happened in the new left with Reagan too. I think we forget that because it lost and liquidated out so quickly. I talk about the Max Elbaum Revolutions in the book. I always tell people to read it. There's caveats about it. I've read some of the left communist critiques of it on my show. But I will point out that, like, I've always found it interesting that, like, it at least gets us to ask the question, where did all these motherfuckers go in the 1980s? Because they just seemed to disappear. Like, it was like, yes, some of them became bog standard Democrats, but most of the average rank and file people did not. We don't really know what happened to them, except that they depoliticized somewhere. Maybe they voted for Reagan. Maybe they didn't vote. Probably a lot of them didn't vote anymore. Like, we just don't know. And I think we are living through a time where that is a real risk right now. So as these protests meet the reality of the state, and that, like, a lot of people's delusions about, like, elite institutions being woke, which I think they could kind of fool themselves about their recuperation of, like, BLM and Me Too rhetoric.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of this, like, naivete about supporting the liberals' use of, like, tech censorship through private means maybe wasn't a great idea. And, like, I think there's a lot of cows coming home right now. The thing is, though, like, if we ask ourselves about these protesting kids, they're 19, 20, 21 years old, right? Like 22, 23. They're young. Like, I'm literally almost old enough to be their fucking parent, right?
Yeah.
And I have been thinking about what our role should be, and I've come to a similar conclusion to you. You and I aren't going to build a party. We're just not. Like, we could have. We failed. We tried. I know I tried a couple times. Like, I always pick the wrong dog. So, like, people don't listen to me when I tell you what political function to join, because I'm almost always picking the wrong guy.
Yeah.
So listen to me about critiques. So listen to me about when I tell you what you should join. So, because I thought the IWW was going to be where we all ended up, not the DSA, but I was wrong. That was a long time ago. But nonetheless, I think my job right now is to both teach but not overly dictate. Like, and this is a hard thing. I think a lot of new leftists struggled with this because who were our fucking mentors? Our mentors were the youngest members of the new left who were still around when we were, like, in our 20s and 30s. They were the people we read. They were your Mike Davises. They were your David Harveys. They were your Bernie Sanderses, honestly. They were your old crotchety anarchist indoor trot at your meeting that annoyed you. Old school Stalinist who came up in the 70s and was a member of the CPUSA in the really bad times. Like, those were our mentors, because it was otherwise you were listening to Democrats or what was coming on Democracy Now. Those were your options, right? And a lot of us even started out in the Democracy Now world. I mean, like, and it both pushed me, that world pushed me out and pulled me back in, depending on the time period we were talking about. But and then reality happened. The recession happened, and it made us, like, really actually pay attention to these people in a way that we had not before. History caught up to them in some ways. This is the millennial left, as we've understand it, is we're going to be doing an autopsy on it ourselves, probably. So this is, like, weird. It's like vivisecting yourself while you're still alive.
Yeah.
Like, it's a very weird place to be. But I think that's what we're going to have to do. But I also think, like, I'm not here to, like, I am on team, like, hey, the kids are not all right. They're more fucked up than you know. There's all kinds of, like, we have failed them. And that's why they're fucked up. It's not their fault. It's our fault, or even their parents' fault. It's, like, our aunts and uncles' fault, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But, But our role now is to both realize that our job is to teach them, because they're going to be the people doing the fucking work. They are right now. But also not to dictate shit to them, because who are we to dictate? We failed. Like we're basically coming to them and being like, hey, can you not do what we did? Which is also a hard pitch. Like, listen to me so that you don't make my mistake. And that's what, to me, why this year is going to be so crucial, because we have the election coming up. We have the fact, I think Joe Biden is, it's still, I would feel every election cycle, I'm like, it's getting harder and harder for me to call the election. But like, I feel like I don't really know what's going to happen. We're still pretty far out. But we know that Trump and Biden somehow felt both hated and inevitable this entire time. Like, nobody wanted them, yet no one saw a way around them. Like,
well, it's also, I mean, they're both old enough to where it's not out of the realm of possibilities that one of them just dies of natural causes at some point. It's to where, like, and that thought to me is maybe
okay. Yeah. Well, if Biden dies right now, what the fuck happens?
What happens? What happens?
Like, because there's no obvious Democratic backbench ready to like take over.
Yeah.
Like, if Trump dies, I have even less idea what happens to the GOP at that point. Like because the GOP right now seems to be that dude. Like,
yeah.
Like,
that's a really dangerous situation that could, like, I mean, I feel like a death of either one would put the U.S. electoral system into a total spiral at that point.
Well, my frenemy of the show and a person who I often disagree with, but I think was right about this, Doug Lane told me privately that he says whoever wins this next election, we're likely in a constitutional crisis. And I'm like, yep.
Yeah.
Like either way, actually, I think we're likely in a constitutional crisis.
Yeah.
And I mean, my nightmare scenario is somehow Trump wins the popular vote and Biden wins the Electoral College. Like, which would just, that would fuck with everybody. But also it would like lead to political instability like crazy, because you can imagine what the right would be doing with that.
Yeah, I also I mean, I'm giving some thought towards like maybe like an election every 4 years is not the best way to go about things.
No.
Just, like renewing with a different person every 4 years is not the best way to keep our foreign allies on our side or have any sort of modicum of extended time-based trust. I don't think that as a population, we kind of traumatize every 4 years, and election season has become so drawn out. It starts 2 years ahead of time, where it's like we're constantly in an election season. And it seems like the way that our country is, to where like it's so divided, it seems like our electoral system, the way it's designed, is not really meant to function with so many on either side, because like a win on either end is supposed to be like an adequate compromise, and it's just not a compromise. It's kind of a zero-sum game in many ways. So yeah, I mean, if one of these guys dies, who knows what the fuck happens. There's still plenty of things that can happen in the meantime that are just legitimate parts of the electoral process that could send us into a chaotic sort of free fall as well, like you mentioned with the Electoral College versus the popular vote.
Are one of the states going rogue and doing something weird by like changing its
right? Is there going to be all sorts of court shenanigans and stuff like that? I mean, are we ready for another election conspiracy?
Also, right. We've also, the Democrats have shown that despite demand for it, they wanted to bury the call to reform the Supreme Court and the judicial system immediately.
Oh,
like you were even 3 years ago they were talking about that, and now it's just like off the table.
Yeah.
Even though like all the shit that we were supposedly worried about has now happened. Like,
yeah.
It's just it's crazy to me where we are, and yet I think if I was going to tell people what to do, I don't know that Gaza by itself is something that the left can reconstitute itself on. For one thing is, I don't think we should, I mean, and this is going to sound weird. I think there's a left-wing response to this where we can pivot honestly and fairly about what we want and why we want it. But I think trying to just hook ourselves up to this and being like, okay, but Gaza liberation, we're all about it. Also, here's our platform. Like
Mhm.
that second part's never gonna happen.
Yeah.
Like, so we have to use this in a way to like kind of get right with ourselves about where we are and what we want. Because the other thing I will say is like beyond the ceasefire. I mean, this is one thing I will say very quickly.
Hmm.
Uh, we don't really have a vision for what happens after this. Like once this is over, okay, two-state solution not viable. One-state solution, who's going to impose it? What are you going to do? Like where are you gonna move? Like a couple million Mizrahi Jews who don't have a country in Europe to go back to. Like there's there's all and the best case scenario that happens internal to I'll tell you the best case scenario that happens if Israel itself decides. Gaza loses a third of its land, a tenth of its population, and is allowed independence, but is still not really a viable state. It's supported by international aid or something. And the West Bank, and this is what Israel has this way, is recapitulated as a way to get by the international people to give the West Bankers the right to vote.
Mm.
And there you go. Like that's the best case scenario from the political process within Israel itself. That's the best you're gonna get. All right. So you need an outside fix, but like, what outside fix is there? Like, I was thinking about this the other day. Like, let's say you actually did the radical thing you did from the river to the sea, right? But you can't resettle all those Jews, so they have to be part of polity, which means you're going to need like UN peacekeepers there to oversee a political transition and rights and adjudications for probably a generation. That I don't see anyone doing that.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well,
and
you can't fucking Israel will bomb the shit out of you, including, aid workers.
right,
Like it's not even possible in any of these scenarios with them doing the things that they do with impunity.
right.
Um, you
So
know, yeah.
yeah, I mean, uh, well, I mean, here's the other thing that's happened that maybe the left should be able to say something about a little bit more cogently. The international rules-based order is fucking dead. It's dead.
That's why I
Like,
keep returning to the concept of like all countries signing on to an ICC sort of thing, because like rules based order being dead. I mean, I think that the rules based order thing. I obviously like Putin doing an old fashioned land grab was like not helpful towards this, but we have been the largest purveyor of enabling the rules based order to fall apart while simultaneously saying that we uphold them. It's like we're the bad guys in all of this. We're the
absolutely.
dude, like, and so part of me, I mean, I feel like I was half asleep thinking about this, but what would it look like if the Palestinians were atop of the ICC in a way, like put the suffering on top of the court that holds all nations accountable, sort of thing. And if we could, I mean, I don't know, maybe it's a little too Star Trekky to think of, a little too,
Well,
yeah,
I do think if the Comintern was to be anything like, again, our one of the things it would have to be is like we would be working to establish something like an international arbitration system, because we all know that we're like, even though if our ultimate goal is no nations, like um, communism, that stuff is not all that relevant. Like, but we also know that we don't get there tomorrow. Like, even if we
yeah,
have the revolution, we don't get there tomorrow. And the revolution, do you want it to be global nuclear war? Because no. So then that leads you to the question of, okay, what the prospects is going to be. How do you get states to interact? How do you intervene? And it does have to be something like the ICC, but for everybody and controlled by proles. Like
yeah,
like
yeah,
it's got to be because the one thing I have told people, and this is maybe a little bit of my own realism, is like, just because, even if we had the communist revolution tomorrow and the working class actually won, this idea that we'd all just magically get along, even if the workers were in charge of everything, That's like the idea that the bourgeoisie, because they're all bourgeoisie, actually magically get along. They only get along when they're opposing us. They don't get along with each other.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
and like, I think that's something we'd have to deal with. And with the Palestinians, they deserve justice and recompense. You know, after
yeah,
this is all over, they deserve it. I mean, and you're this is coming from a person who says justice is a like fairy tale we tell to children, but still, like, this cannot go unaddressed, or it's going to go down as a world historic tragedy. Like, you know, it's going to be like at least the Armenian genocide, like, and maybe worse. And like, you know, it's easy to make restitution 100 years later when like when everybody's dead. But that's not, we don't want that in this scenario. And the other thing that makes me think about this is like, okay, once this is all over, however it settles out, where do we go for here? What's the international movement that we're behind? Because I don't see that on the horizon either right now. Like, it's not clear to me that there's an obvious force in the world that the left, not just the Western left, the world left goes, okay, they're the good guys. Like, it's not clear to me at all right now. I mean, China's the closest thing you got to it, but even then, like, there are different factions and stuff in China that are not, which I'm also going to admit, as much as I follow Chinese politics, are not opaque to me. I mean, they're not clear to me what they are. So I don't know what that future is, but I do think there's hope in that the Gen Zers did watch us fail very quickly and in real time. Like, and why do I think that's a sign of hope? It's because I do think it's going to be harder for them to be pushed into making the same tactical mistake concessions that we made. Like, now I don't know where that goes because I have no idea how you deal with you know, feeling like you don't have a party again. I mean, like, there's nobody that represents you. But the truth of the matter is there was nobody who represented us ever. It was just like we somehow got the wrong impression that maybe we could be represented within one of the two forces with relatively little pushback, and that was wrong. So
yeah. I mean, I feel like you know, it came as a shocking realization to me years ago when I realized that we don't have a Labour Party. And you watch UK politics, they're a Labour Party. It's called Labour. And it seems to be a thing that countries do where they form a political party based on the working class and call it Labour. And, you know, Labour is subjugated to the, you know, progressive wing of the Democratic Party for all intents and purposes. And it's not really well represented at all anyway. But there's not a representative of, there's not even like, this is why, like, I mean, I admire Max. He heads up a whole news outlet, the Real News Network, based on working class politics news, like what news relevant to the working class. And part of the project for him, you know, interviewing working people is that the voices of working people are conspicuously absent from most media, given, you know, mainstream media news. It's just, you just don't hear their voices. So that there is not a party that represents us. Yeah, that's the way it's always been, and has always been this, you know, this sort of this big lie around like the Democratic Party representing your interest and your, you know, the Democratic Party can't even codify Roe v. Wade, you know, and the Democratic Party can't even ensure you get a living wage, and the Democratic Party can't even not go to war, and
they can't protect trans rights because they'll farm it out to the state level, and the states will be more barbaric, and yet they won't do anything about it. Like,
yeah, it's just it's fucking ridiculous, dude. That like there's nothing left to vote for, other than like an anti-Trump sort of thing. And even that has lost its appeal because Biden has continued on Trump's policies and he's enacting a genocide. At this point, he's responsible for it.
That's what I say. Like, Trump doesn't have a genocide under his belt, honestly.
He doesn't have a genocide, right, you know? So, I mean, all of this, man, is like November. This is grim. This is like, I have no idea how I would even go about convincing anybody right now to vote for the Democratic Party, based on any sort of firm, policy-based argument. Like, there's nothing policy-wise that is redeemable or anything towards any of this stuff. I mean, it's hard to be redeeming towards being complicit in genocide, but like, I feel like there's a real Roe v. Wade going out has done a good job of convincing some liberals that, like, yeah, they're going to lie to you and they're not going to do anything about it, and they're going to make you promises and they're not going to make good on them. And so
and
it doesn't do any,
no structural. Here's the thing that I point out: as long as it's federalized, as long as you don't get a federal ban, right? In which case, then the Democrats might actually do something. But as long as it's federalized, they have no reason structurally, game theoretically, to do anything about it, because they can use it to motivate people to finally come out to vote for them in red states, particularly women. And even though in polls that I think is only showing it, like, most people only consider it, like 3% of the population consider it a really make or break issue right now. I wonder if that's going to change, particularly if you start seeing access to other forms of contraception go away. But it's wild to me that was a lesson. Yeah, they did nothing. They did nothing about Supreme Court reform. They took it off the docket. They did nothing about Medicare reform or Medicaid reform. Not even Medicare reform. I mean, just talking about like fixing those programs and do that. They did very little about climate change. I saw Clinton share something about how Trump thing would accelerate us away from the Paris Accord, and then it had like Biden's projections, and they were just below Trump's. And I was like, you guys don't even see this as a self-own, like, that you can't even like advertise that you're keeping up with with Obama's promises in the Paris Accords, like, and you're celebrating this as a world historic whatever. You've done nothing about the level of indebtedness in the country. That's all gotten worse. And I don't mean like I'm not one of these austerity men. I don't mean like the public.
No.
I mean like people have been surviving off credit cards extensively. Data backs this up for like the last year. Like, that's not sustainable. That's going to eventually explode. There's a retail real estate that's going to eventually explode, despite the fact that residential real estate's insane right now. And what's weird to me is the left doesn't even have anything to say about most of this, really. Like, we say it's bad, but like, do we have a plan anymore? And I know it's contradictory because I'm like,
well, what's the plan for like stopping Zillow from buying up all the residential houses and causing a bubble to burst? Like, how do you take action against that?
Right.
What's the action plan for food inflation when the cost of food is going up and nobody can afford it? And what do we go, like, picket a farm or something? I mean, like, what's so many of these economic forces are things that we don't have any direct, or at least it seems like we don't have direct control over, which is why I think, like, maybe that I do have some hope for like the 2028 general strike that the UAW Sean Fain guys mentioned. Like, that to me is something that, but I mean, dude, you have to find little glimpses of optimism to hold on to. And I remember over the summer it was like the UPS strike. I thought that was, I mean, I remember coming out of understanding that the UMWA, the United Mine Workers Association, was going to lose a 23-month strike with no gains and deliver an unconditional return to work. And out of the devastation of feeling that for those mine workers, the only thing I could really think about was like, dude, just look forward to summer at this point with like UPS going on strike. And now I'm kind of thinking, well, let's look forward to 2028 with this general strike possibility. But it's hard to find hope, realistic hope out of this. Like, I was very hesitant to, like, I saw when these university protests erupted, like, array of people on Facebook were like, oh man, the kids are all right, dude. Look, the world's going to be okay. It's in their hands. And it's like, no, dude, they said that about every fucking generation. They said that about Occupy. They said that about, the housing crisis. It's like, yeah, I don't know what our role is in this other than to maybe like use media to get these points in education and stuff like that out there for consumption and to, because we're not going to, I mean, Gen Z is not going to be able to do all this on their own,
No.
and they're one removed, like you said, it's like,
They're
hey,
a
stop.
small generation too compared to the millennials. They're much smaller as far as numbers of population. Like, it's I mean, we have to be fair to that. Like, the left. I mean, honestly, if I'm completely honest, I don't even think we're doing this for Gen Zers anymore. We're doing this so that Gen Z keeps their head on straight, so that like the next generation after them can fucking do something, which is actually not that far away. It's about 15 years out. But like, the thing is, we can't continue. Like, I'm with you. We can't. The strategy of patience has something to be recommended for it. But if your patience is more than 5 generations out now, we don't have that time.
We're not fucking muscular liberals who think that patience is a virtue and shit. It's like, to me, it's like, when do our ideological preferences become existential necessities? And I think that we're beyond that time at this point. So when I look at Gen Z doing this, I'm filled with some hope, but I'm also like, my heart is fucking breaking too, because they don't know they're going to get crushed. And I mean, not politics is what, like 99% disappointment.
Yeah,
it's all black pill disappointment in terms of aspirational goals that always seem out of reach, and small modicums of gains that are, I don't know, take the victories and celebrate when you can, because you're going to have a truck drive through your house soon thereafter anyway. We all celebrated like we did something well for George Floyd, and and now also Eric Adams. We had all of Black Lives Matter it seems like the uppers are the public opinion is that they were all scammers or something at this point. Like
I mean, the fact that the fact that there were certain organizations that were scammy has not helped. And they also, I want to say this, the left did not address that. The left hid from that and let the right set the tone, which of course meant that like one organization got to represent, Black Lives Matter was like, in my city, there's 5 different Black Lives Matter organizations, often opposed to one another. So it's like, it's not one thing. And I also remember I was reading Vincent Bevan's book because I was pretty harsh on it, but I figured Ben will read it, right? Like, and I've been sort of, even with that, I'm like, okay, so you learned that horizontalism doesn't work, but like, your answer is, wouldn't it be great if we had a 1914 party though? And I'm like, yeah, but we've been saying that shit for 100 years. Like, can you quit? Like that's like, X is fucked up. Y missing. World revolution. Like, come on.
Where's your partner in thinking of this? Like, where's the history or the thinkers you've read that assist you and guide your thought towards more interesting and useful conclusions? I mean, we can all grab the low-hanging fruit, and we've all been grabbing it for 100 years, like you said.
There's not a whole lot of low-hanging fruit left.
Yeah, like, and also, like, all of our small victories are fucking disappearing, man. Like, I feel like you mentioned the Amazon labor union. Now we have one warehouse, and it's my understanding there's some things going on internally with ALU that are not voting well for things right now. And
right,
so it's what is it like? We're just watching the same thing that happened to the DSA in a way too. It's like, we're hopeful for them, and then all of a sudden their own systems of internal arbitration became suspect and running out of money now and stuff. It's like, we have to take care of maintenance around these small victories we get, because if we don't, over time they just kind of fade out. But think about Amazon too. Amazon's just sitting around waiting for that thing to crumble. The weight of their own existence will do well to crumble that, to crush that over time if they just wait it out.
Which is interesting to me. I mean, like, I guess this goes back to my thing about the both strength and weakness of the state. And I guess this is my final point, and I'll let you make your final point. But like, I was actually surprised how much they fought some of these labor unions, given how ineffective labor unions are. So I was like, man, like they don't want to give. It does make me wonder if like there's something we're not understanding about profitability or something, because it's not. It's kind of irrational. Like, it is, and I mean this in a sense of like, this is the kind of like blatant power stuff that breaks things over the long term. Like, and one of the great ironies, you're talking about losing, there's a possibility that the Supreme Court decides in a way, I don't know if this has happened yet, I don't think it has, that on this like Amazon Trader Joe's ACLU lawsuit, about the NCLB, that actually undoes the Wagner Act. Or the Wagner Act, which would actually set us back to pre-1930s levels of organizational rights. Which is like, if that happens off the pen of the Supreme Court, that will be like, well, left, what do you do now? Because your last hope just got completely pushed into a non-legal form of activism. And I mean, I'm not saying unions would be illegal overnight, but they would be suable for like lost profits and shit for work stoppage and stuff. And that's basically like the ability to compel you to work, because not only could they compel you from your labor, but they can also punish you for costing them profits.
Right.
Like, it's that'd be wild. And that's not, I don't think that's the most likely outcome, but we're not far from it. And these are things that I think have kind of been on the table for a while that we just haven't been looking at very straight. Like, you know, like with the Democrats going after Trump, actually, if you go for the king, you actually kind of have to win.
Yeah.
Like, and we didn't win. And I don't know. I don't want to just sit down and feel bad about it. I do think like this is a time to learn. This is time to regroup. But I also, in some ways, think this is a time to think too and think through this and be like, okay, like we don't want to jump on the liberal bandwagon and condemn these protests for being ineffective or whatever. That's not useful either. What do we do? Well, how do we help? How do we help beyond just like, oh, we're gonna bail them out of prison, on another bail fund, like, yeah, we do that too, but like that's not building a political movement, guys. Like that's just reacting. Anyway, that's my last point. What's your last point, Jules?
Yo, I'm here. How do we help?
Yeah, how do we help? What's your last point here?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a great answer on how do we help. I mean, I feel like we've gone through the motions of talking about inflation at this point and how everyone's struggling to get by, and who knows what kind of talking about like I'm sure that students right now are in need of material support in their protests, and it would be good to support them materially. But I think we need to look forward to hopefully what kind of politics this births. There's a whole lot of talk about the 99% versus the 1% after Occupy, and that still has not left public sentiment. And, that sort of rhetoric was unheard of before Occupy. And I think that we are seeing somewhat of a politics birthed out of that now, which is related to like the Israel the Party for Israel, like the funding and buying off of government officials, so they uphold Israel's bottom line and their need for weapons and defense and all that stuff, and the continued impunity of carrying on genocide like that. We might be seeing like the birth of a politics that at least incorporates this sort of critical rhetoric towards the behavior of Israel at this point. So how do we help? I question a lot of the methodology of taking part in protests. What do they gain us? What do we, I don't know what we do to help other than read a fucking book and figure out what's been done in the past and figure out the echoes and rhyming of history, and at least be here to witness it with all the rest of us who are witnessing the slow motion train wreck. Like, I'd much rather be in this position than wondering where this sort of feeling like this is like a temporal anomaly or something that's happening. Like anything that's happening is novel. Like that to me is when I start feeling like things are novel and it's happening the first time in history. It's like that's not an indication that I'm witnessing history as much as it's something like I'm ignorant of history somewhere. So yeah, so I don't think any of this stuff is novel. We've obviously seen the stuff, and we know where it goes, you know, and we know that it's not enough. So, you know, my hope for this stuff, man, is that like every Gen Z person who's watching this is getting a little more radicalized, you know, like, and part of what gives me hope is knowing that radicalization comes from many different areas. It's not just about being oppressed anymore. It's not just about, you know, desperation. You know, people are getting radicalized off of TikTok videos and emails. You know, like I have a friend who is not particularly left oriented who said something a couple times. You know, when people repeat themselves, it's like kind of an indication of what is going on in their train of thoughts. And one of them was like, she was like, "Oh yeah, I'm calling out to work tomorrow because you know I saw this this video where a person died in their office, and the day after an email was sent out, and they just spread the work around and said, you know, remember to take your PTO days." And but that is the small sort of germination of radicalization that I think that a lot of us have been feeling in society, and the opportunity for those, you know, notions to crystallize in the minds of some, you know, is furthered by watching this happen in front of us. I mean, so I think that as our days proceed ahead of us, there's going to be more youth that will be radicalized. There's going to be more everyday people who are dismayed by what's going on in the world, and just in the same way that we've seen public policy shift around Gaza now, which I don't think any of us would have, you know, expected within our lifetime to find such critical rhetoric of Israel at this point being mainstream with a nonpartisan sort of slant to it. You know, maybe it's been a week when a decade happens. I don't know. How do we help? I keep coming back to that question here as you asked it. I don't really know. I don't really have a great answer, dude. As for me and what I'm doing, I just, like I said at the start of this, man, I feel like I've tried to help with the party, and I'm still part of the party, and I'm still consider myself an activist. I still, you know, I'm contributing towards this work, but I find that I feel like some of the work that I've contributed that's perhaps made any impact at all, or the most impact out of any of it, has been the stuff I've done with media. Has been some of the interviews I've helped publish. Has been some of the media that's come through me, you know, and I want to continue to do that because that there's not only a residual effect there where like these things will be forever in the digital ether, right? You can always find them. They're ingrained in the annals of that digital ether. But two, you know, it's a one-to-many approach. It's like having a bullhorn all the time. And I, as much as I think that we need to have conversations with our neighbors, we need to have conversations with many of our neighbors simultaneously. You know, it's kind of how I feel about it. I mean, that's really all I got, other than to say shit's grim, it's dark out there, and hopefully we're closer insofar as we are pessimistic, and you know that's the way the world really is. Maybe we're that much closer to the truth. Hopefully, you know, I would hate to be far off from the truth, being this pessimistic about it. You know,
that'd be a real bummer.
Real bummer. Yeah.
Like it is both sad and we're still wrong.
Yeah.
That oh man, that's and on that note, I think we're gonna end the show.
All right, man.
I'm laughing at how dark it can possibly get. All right, and on that note, see you guys out.
See you later.